George, do we have any understanding as to, the average Boeing employee out there in the Pacific Northwest, how much does he or she have in savings or any of that kind of stuff? Does a company game that stuff out? Because I can tell you, just in my family, the day healthcare lapses is the day when the hammer comes down. Do we have any understanding about the health of the Boeing worker out there?
I've not seen anything that gives us a sense for how much they have saved up. I think if they're a typical American worker, I wouldn't expect them to have multiple months worth of even pay sitting in a bank account. I think the union does pay them some money while on strike, but like you said, I think once healthcare gets into the game, that could be really expensive and pretty scary, right? And so, but I don't have any statistics on it, unfortunately.
How's Boeing's finances holding up?
About to find out, right? So we'll have earnings here in a couple of weeks. I sense that they're probably sub $10 billion in cash because we've heard noises about them raising money. And so, I guess we're going to find out how much they could really stem the burn. They've had they've talked about involuntary layoffs and I guess, rotating workers through layoffs so they can preserve cash. I'm sure they're taking other internal steps to try to minimize cash burn, but just the noises we're hearing makes me think that cash is going to look pretty rough at the end of 3Q, and especially sort of post 3Q.
Which brings up the capital markets solution or move here. What do you think the Boeing might do as it relates to incremental debt and/or equity?
I guess if I was the company, which of course I am not, but if I was the company, I would think that equity would give you more flexibility here, right? You don't have to pay it back. You don't pressure the rating agencies. Your shareholders are disappointed, but you might be able to go to them later and say this is for the long-term health of the company, because they do have to be worried about whatever they agree to here, right? They have to live with it for the next 4 years. And so I would guess that equity gives them more flexibility, and so therefore they might be more interested going that direction. The stock's already under pressure. It's been under pressure for a while, so it's a bit challenging. That's my thought.
Yeah, I mean, for a while, you look at just this year, Boeing stock is down 40%. So you're like, hey, guys, what's another 10%? Come on, you already stuck it out this far. So it seems to me, if we just look at it strategically, that you have until the 23rd for when Boeing reports earnings before the bell. And then if we think that October 1st is when you had healthcare run out for some union workers, like that feels like pressure then on both ends. Because it feels like Boeing's going to want to go to their conference call with something firm or legitimate or something that provides some clarity over the next 6 months at least.
I think so, but again, this is something that management has to live with, whatever they agree to here for the next 4 years. This will be, interestingly enough, too, be Kelly Ortberg's first call, right? So I guess it sounds like unless a miracle happens, he's gonna kick it off with a pretty dour call. So one of the things I see on the table is return to a pension. I just don't think any U.S. company can go back there. And so, again, I think it makes it really challenging here. I think as near as I can tell, the recent port strike, it looks like they got most of the pay they wanted, if not all the pay that the dock workers wanted. I think they're still got to agree on automation. Potentially tells me that labor is in a stronger hand than maybe even I thought it was. The recent employment report looked pretty good from a labor perspective, from a labor strength perspective. So it could mean the fight is a little bit longer, right? Because again, I don't think you can give in on pension plan as a U.S. corporate anymore.
Yep. All right, George, thanks so much for joining us. George Ferguson, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Aerospace, Defense, and Airlines Analyst, trying to get some clarity on kind of where the Boeing is going with their workers out in the Pacific Northwest. Again, as George has told us in the past, this is a cash burn situation, and you know, the longer they go without delivering these planes, the tougher the cash situation becomes for Boeing. Tomorrow, folks, at 9:30 a.m. Wall Street time, J.P. Morgan Chairman and CEO Jamie Dimon sits down for an exclusive interview with Bloomberg's Lisa Abramowitz at the J.P. Morgan Techstars Conference in London. The pair will be discussing global markets, tech investments, risk and opportunities within the world of AI, the global economy, and the U.S. elections. One of the great things about Jamie Dimon is he's got strong opinions, and he's not shy about sharing them, because who's going to tell Jamie Dimon to
not say those
down?
things?
Yes.
Yeah. What would be your question for him right now? I feel like mine would either be around the fiscal deficit, like medium term, and the relevance of central banks in the future.
And how worried is he at all about this election coming up? You know, because again, I think he would have some pretty strong views there as well. But and what I like about J.P. Morgan and Bank of America as well, but you know, J.P. Morgan talks to every single business on the planet, basically. You know, especially, you know, small and mid-sized businesses through their Chase branches, and then of course the global corporate, the economy with the big J.P. Morgan corporate investment banks. So they see everything. They see the consumer with their card business, and so you just get a really holistic view of kind of what's happening out there.
I'm much more concerned with Goldman Sachs and what they're going to do with their Marcus high yield savings rate, because it has come down. With that really solid jobs report, do we stop lowering that savings rate? And then does that mean that people like me just keep their money in money market funds and a high yield savings account longer than we thought? Speaking of, 10-year yield 4%.
I know, we're back above 4.02%. The 2-year sitting right there, 3.99%. So rates moving higher here. Again, that strong jobs number as well. I'm going to call out crude oil, because you just don't talk about it enough. Over $76 a barrel there, up 2.6% for WTI.
I definitely talk about it. All right, coming up, Virgil Call is President and CEO Investment Advisor at Spring Ridge Financial Group. We'll discuss what to do in this market.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg News with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's start off in the commodity space. Brent, the international benchmark for oil, rising to $80 a barrel. This is the first time since August. As for stocks, they're edging lower after Treasury yields hit their highest level since the summer. And Friday's blowout report on jobs growth trimming expectations of another jumbo rate cut from the Federal Reserve. PepsiCo is going to report its latest quarterly results tomorrow, but the momentum is really going to pick up later in the week on Friday. That's when you get J.P. Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, and Bank of New York Mellon reporting their earnings. Banks dominating the early days of the reporting season. Right now, shares of Super Microcomputer, the best performing stock in the S&P 500, up close to 14%. Earlier, the company disclosed shipment data. Bloomberg Intelligence writing the data suggests customer demand is robust. And Pfizer also outperforming up just around 3%. Activist investor Starboard Value taking a stake of about $1 billion in Pfizer. S&P 500 right now 13 points lower at 57.37. That's down about 0.2%. Dow Jones Industrial Average 105 points lower, and the NASDAQ 100 down 72 points, a decline of 0.4%. Two-year yield up 6 basis points, right now 3.98. The 10-year 5 basis points higher, and that is at 4.01%. And we check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Alex and Paul.
All right, JT, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Alex Steele, Paul Sweeney. We are live here in Orlando, Florida, at the Commonwealth National Conference for Financial Advisors. A lot going on in the marketplace here. A lot of discussion amongst these financial advisors as they continue to look after their clients' money. Alex, a headline just crossing the Bloomberg terminal. Brent oil rises to $80 a barrel, the first time since August. It's getting real out there.
It's a geopolitical risk premium, clearly, that's priced into the oil market, and the question is how long does it stay there, and should more actually be priced in? So you're seeing a lot of analyst notes now come out with their bull-bear case, like their spread now, their fan of oil prices based on that is quite high. Second headline crossing now, President Biden declaring Florida's emergency over Hurricane Milton. So glad I changed that flight from Wednesday morning.
Very smart. Let's check in with our next guest here, right here in Orlando at the conference. Virgil Kale, President and CEO, Investment Advisor at Spring Ridge Financial Group. The firm is Global Wealth Advisors. Virgil, thanks so much for joining us here.
Happy to be here.
What's the conversation you're having with your clients these days? The S&P's up 20%. I don't know. We got an election coming up. What's the conversation like?
Well, I think I could speak for myself and many other financial advisors that since July, we're happy that the market's broadening out.
Okay.
Because for the last year and a half, we just had a concentrated market, and everybody was so laser focused on how am I doing compared to the S&P, and it got to a point where the S&P was no longer as diversified as we'd like it to be. And so I kind of start with, okay, most of my clients are in retirement or heading into retirement. And we've been blessed because of the extreme increases in interest rates to have better yield than we've had in more than a decade. Mm-hmm. And so when you know that you can make some money without taking a lot of risk, and you have many parts of the bond market that are trading below par, and yields to worse that are 6, 7, 8%, and you compare that to the higher valuations of the S&P, you start to think, okay, well, remember diversification. Remember that things don't go up forever, and income is a part of your return. And, before price conscious and we increased, the S&P became more tech focused, and it was price up, price down. Income was a big part of a person's return prior to the zero interest rate environment. So to me, in this environment, looking to add income and to diversify, and thank God we've seen that we kind of have a situation short term, just as of Friday, that we might have stocks and bonds going down together, right? Like we did last fall, August, September, October. But in August, when we had the scary sell-off, it was like, okay, bonds were doing their job. They were going up with this. So we like to think that right now, I think the market's trying to digest, okay, so we thought the economy was slowing down, but soft landing. we were saying it's normalizing.
Mhm.
And that's nice. That's a nice word, normalizing. It's, we're way past the pandemic now. But it's kind of like, okay, a couple months ago, we got the data point that there was an 818,000 job revision, right? And then Friday, we get a surprise over 100,000 more jobs. And it's like, okay, which data point is correct, And granted, the economy and the stock market, the market's a leading indicator, right? So the market wants to get happy, but not too happy, to cause interest rates to go up, because then we'll have this volatility that shakes everything up.
So you're basically describing, that soft landing, that Goldilocks. And to your point about the jobs number, Citi had a note out that said, look, they are skeptical about that soft landing and say we could see revisions later, and then that's going to affect how we view the overall economy. So if you're looking at a 60-40, is still 60-40 the right way to go, or would you need some?
Not for everybody, right?
Right. Okay. So not for everybody.
But, I think a lot of people would be happy to make, I think there's a chart that if interest rates fall by 1%, we already got a 0.5% cut, that the upside to many parts of the bond market, excluding the 30-year Treasury, because I think that has too much volatility for most people, is like 5.5% to 12% returns on the upside, and maybe 2 to 4% on the downside in the bond market. And I'm thinking a lot of people that are heading into retirement or in retirement would be happy with the 5 to 12 with very low downside versus a market that's kind of riding high. And I'm only saying that from the standpoint of the growth part of the market. That I kind of think that, decide how much volatility do you want to take to get that extra couple percent. If you don't need it, are you willing to take the 10% downside, the 15% downside? So I just love that income can buffer volatility now. I think there's great dividends in many of the value side of the market, and the international markets. And everybody's like, oh, the market's overvalued, but the equal weight S&P isn't overvalued. The small and mid caps are as attractive to the large caps as they've been since the year 2000. So there's just like a lot of dislocations that I see where, wow, why is everybody chasing this when there's all these other things that are not expensive, that if interest rates do in fact continue to come down, you have to kind of look at your portfolio and say, okay, now it's a different environment. We're not in a rate hiking environment, we're a rate cutting environment. What parts of the market are going to do well when rates are coming down? And it's the companies that have a lot of debt that get helped, and wages are holding up okay, and people are still spending. So, I think there's something to be said for opportunities.
If many of your clients are either in retirement or approaching retirement, how about alternatives? Is that not something for them? Because I hear a lot of RAs that they do talk about alternatives.
Yeah, and I do think alternatives have their space in a portfolio. A lot of people don't understand them. I think it's interesting, the media in general, we focus so much on the stock market, and then I'll have a person say, explain the bond market to me. And then, okay, we're going to explain the bond market, then we're going to explain alternatives, and then how can a person track what that alternative is supposed to do? Because I think a client is comfortable when they understand their portfolio and why it's structured the way it is, and does that resonate with their thoughts on the economy and the world and geopolitical risk and all these things that we have to deal with. And days like today when we see, and even last week with the Middle East conflict, that when you have energy kind of being the sector that's going well, I'm thinking that's not a healthy market. Remember 2022, energy did well, nothing else did. So it's kind of worry about that.
So when you take a look, we were just talking about, bonds and where to take risk there. Do you think that the money, are you telling your clients that have money in money market funds or high yield savings account, do they stay there, or do they need to put that money to work elsewhere? And I guess when do they do that?
So reinvest is a big risk, because people got kind of happy with their 5+% cash rates. And we've been talking to almost every client, if you don't need this money for the next year, if you need it, then keep it in a money market, because you're going to use it anyway. But this is the time, and actually I would say the best time would have probably been last October when the 10-year yield was 5, right? And the bells rang, and it was like, oh my God, 5! We haven't seen 5 on a 10-year in a long time. So I kind of think even now, okay, the 10-year is above 4, and the market doesn't like that, and everything's kind of repricing short term. But I think that if you consistently invest and you're diversified across all areas of the income market, knowing that 90+% of your return is going to come from your starting yield, I think it's a nice little setup.
So here we are at the Commonwealth National Conference, 2,000 plus fellow RIAs here. Why do you come here? What do you hope to learn?
I just think Commonwealth Financial Network has done a fantastic job of attracting like-minded professionals. There's a lot of people that are serious professionals. We like to exchange ideas. We learn from each other. There's no like jealousy.
I was like, aren't you all competitors too?
I don't think so.
No,
I think we compete with ourselves,
Okay.
and we try to make ourselves better. So I've gotten a lot of good ideas from my fellow advisors, and I've exchanged some things that I thought were useful, and we all become better, and the industry becomes better because we share ideas.
And how are you growing your business right now?
It's mostly referrals. If we do a really good job for our clients and we stay in touch with them, and we do a lot of people are doing virtual meetings, but we're doing a lot of in-person meetings. That's kind of the nature of our business. And I have a fantastic team. So, I can't be everywhere at all times, but we just have a wonderful team, and we keep our clients very close to us. We know exactly what's going on in their lives, and we know how to adapt their portfolio and their planning to the changes that their lives are.
Where are you based?
We're based in Reading, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
It's Wyomissing, but most people don't know where Wyomissing is. A suburb of Reading.
Right. Okay. So what's a typical client for you guys?
You know what? People have a little bit more money than they used to have.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because I've been in the business for over 20 years. So I would say, the average net worth of a person, if you include their real estate, is probably like 1 to 2 million.
Mm-hmm.
But there are people we service the parents of baby boomers. We service the children of the baby boomers and sometimes the grandchildren.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say, what's the average client, there's a lot of our client base that is the family members, which we want to know the family members. We want to be part of their lives.
And so and that's like a passed down wealth effect, right? And
Exactly.
getting to know, yeah. And how's that going?
I love when a client will bring in, okay, so my son or daughter is going to college and she's considering this industry. Can you talk to them?
Okay. Oh, that's cool.
I love that.
Okay.
And I love to see like their eyes light up, like they're really interested in it. And then sometimes they become interns, and we set them out into the universe to do good things for good people.
First, I was telling my friend about what an RA was, and her eyes just went glazed right over. But I'm just glad you get that from the young kids.
So we're all blessed to be in this industry. To gather knowledge, share knowledge, and improve people's lives is just a wonderful industry.
Virgil, thank you so much for joining us. We
Thank you.
appreciate
Thank you
getting
for
a few
having
minutes
me.
of your time. Virgil Kale, she's a president, CEO, investment advisor at Spring Ridge Financial Group, giving us her thoughts on these markets here and helping folks with their financial planning. I'm looking at the marketplace out here at the moment. We got a little bit of red on the screen here. The S&P is off about 15 points. That's 0.25%. The Dow's off about 150 points. That's about 0.4%. NASDAQ off about 0.3%. 1%. Yields higher. 10-year Treasury, 4.01%. Haven't seen that in quite some time. And we have to call out WTI crude oil up 3%, $76.69. We were down just around 60 several weeks ago before we saw that escalation in the tensions, and it makes sure we keep an eye on that. And for Matt Miller, I'm going to call out Bitcoin up 2%, 63,900. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Traders pulling back bets on another jumbo rate cut from the Federal Reserve after the bang-up jobs report that we saw on Friday. That has sent stocks lower and bond yields pushing higher. Katrina Dudley at Franklin Templeton credits the Federal Reserve with doing a really good job of the economy.
We have been in the soft landing camp for a long period of time in terms of we think that there are so many tools that have been available to be able to kind of land this economy on that landing strip and do something in terms of, managing the inflation and getting that down, which I think we can kind of check mark on that.
S&P 500 down 14 points. Down about 0.25% right now. The Dow Jones Industrial Average 146 points lower, and the Nasdaq 162 points lower. That is down just about 0.3%. In addition, we have crude oil prices. They're pushing higher, yet Brent pushing above $80 for the first time since August. And investors now looking ahead to the U.S. inflation data. That's out Thursday with the release of the Consumer Price Index. And Pfizer climbing after we reported activist investor Starboard Value had taken a stake of about $1 billion in the firm. Pfizer shares up 3.2%. The 2-year yield 5 basis points higher. That's at 3.98. The 10-year yield 4 basis points higher, 4.01% on the 10-year. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Alex and Paul.
All right, thanks so much, John Tucker. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. We're broadcasting to you live from Orlando from Commonwealth's National Conference for Financial Advisors. This year's theme is The Future is Now, and the mission is to help advisors build a blueprint for their future and empower advisors to navigate business transitions. And this is the 10th year that Bloomberg Radio has broadcasted live from the Commonwealth's National Conference. Joining us right here right now in studio, in our makeshift studio, I should say, is Chris Maximovich. He's president of Louisville Headquarters Global Wealth Advisors. He's based in Dallas, and he joins us right here in Orlando. Chris, good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you.
First off, just talk to us about the clients that you serve. Who are they, what their net worth is, and what they're kind of planning for in their questions.
Yeah, we're a holistic wealth management company.
What does holistic mean?
Meaning we really cover every facet of their financial life, ranging from asset management to their estate planning, retirement income planning, to business exit planning for our business owners, and really try to step into their financial shoes the best we can to understand what they're trying to accomplish and help them get there.
I live down at the Jersey Shore, and you drive down the coast, and it's like any part of any coast. Thousands and thousands and thousands of homes on the water, a couple $1 million house, $500,000 boat in the back. I'm like, who are these people? And because there aren't that many Wall Street and New York law jobs for all these people.
Yeah.
These are real people with real businesses. That's my conclusion. And they're creating real wealth. How do you talk to those people when they maybe sell a business and they got to think about what to do with it all? I've already got my house at the down on the water. I've got my boat.
Vespa.
Family's all. I got my Vespa.
He has a Vespa.
Family's all educated. What do I do with this stuff now?
Yeah, the conversation goes from, God, I built this monstrosity of a business all my life, worked hard to get there, accomplished all the things I wanted to accomplish, but now what, right? And it becomes, for a lot of our clients, about legacy, passing it on to the next generation, and in some cases, multiple generations, and not having it become a disruptive force that tears the family apart. I think that commonly, that's the biggest issue our business owners face as they exit their business.
If they don't exit and they're staying in it, I'm assuming cash flow is super important. So what do they come to you for to be able to have sort of cash on hand, et cetera?
Yeah, it starts with basic financial planning principles, having your cash reserve intact and having liquidity, available for all of the unforeseen expenses we can possibly think up. Hurricanes, for our Florida homeowners. Then from there, continuing to build upon, a framework that, hey, if these are the big ticket items I have in front of me the next 3, 5+ years, I need to have liquidity at those stages as well, right? And I think too often we're chasing illiquid, promising, potential investments not taking that into account.
So, what are the types of questions you're getting from your clients these days? I mean, I'll just leave it at that. What do they really need from you today? Maybe how's that changed over the last 10, 15, 20 years?
You know, over the last 20 years, I've been doing this 24 years now, the fast pace of news drives a lot of emotion, right?
Good. Well
So
said.
just last week, I had multiple calls on, the port strikes. Oh my gosh, what is this going to do to the markets? And my response was, we've been through this before, right? We've had strikes before, and more often than not, it's not even a news item in a few days because they probably kicked the can down the road, and it wasn't minutes later, they pushed it to January 15th, I think, right? We don't make decisions on short-term news items.
One thing, though, that isn't short-term is what the Fed is doing. Like, yes, it is, like what the bets are, what they're going to do versus the longer-term, what the Fed funds rate looks like. But what it does mean is lower yields. Even if they're stickier, they're still going to be lower than they are, say, today.
Yeah.
That feels like a done deal. So when and where do you tell your clients to take their money out of money market funds or high-yield savings accounts, and where do you tell them to put it, and when do they do that?
Yeah, great question. We've had, numerous discussions over the last 2 months about positioning, preparing for that. And in some cases, I mentioned illiquidity. Well, in some cases, it makes sense to take some of those liquid funds and move into short-term illiquid, positions, such as money market move to CDs to lock in a longer-term rate. It's a dilemma because obviously rates are coming down. And you do have the opportunity to lock in certain bond instruments or other fixed income instruments right now, but then you take on illiquidity and you've got to go back to that balance.
You're down in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, one of the best economic stories in this country for the last, 50 years, it seems like, at least since I've been in the business. And I know that J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, they put their best people down there in the wealth management. They're opening up wealth management offices. They're not messing around.
Yeah.
How do you compete with those guys?
I don't necessarily think we compete with them. I like to pull some people from them, but
Yep.
I think at the end of the day, there's like you said, it's booming down there, and there's enough people to go around.
Okay.
Right. But we also bring different things to the table. Where they might specialize in certain banking instruments that we can't get our hands on. That's really not our focus anyway. Wealth management. There's 100 different ways to do it, and ultimately, our clients have faith and trust in us that we're doing the right thing.
That's what it always boils down to, is relationships. That's what we keep hearing over and over on that front. I know you mentioned that you want to kind of stay away from short-termism, but we do have a U.S. election. You do have the idea that a budget deficit, fiscal deficit, is just going to keep growing no matter who's in the White House, and that becomes a real issue.
Yeah.
When do your clients care about it? Because you could have said this exact sentence like 25 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, they cared about it when I got in this
25
business
years
in
ago, so
2000.
and they care about now. Yeah.
It's an issue that continues to build and build and build, and eventually we're going to have to deal with it, and it's going to be, I would think, a pretty negative, or have a negative impact on the economy and markets and a lot of wealth. But we have one vote, right? Every one of us has an opportunity to get out and vote for who we think can make a difference there, and I think that's where it starts. I don't have the answer to it, though.
Yep, I don't think a lot of people do. Kick the can down the road. Chris, thanks so much for joining us. Chris Maxikovich, President, Louisville headquarters at Global Wealth Advisors, located down there in the greater Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex down there, which just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Some good stuff there. So looking at these markets here, you bet. Looking at these markets here, yeah, I'm just looking at the S&P 500 and the equity markets. We've got a little bit of a sell-off here. S&P off about 0.3%. The NASDAQ off about 0.4%. And I know the Russell down a little bit more. The smaller cappers off about 0.8%. Yields are back above 4%, folks, on the 10-year Treasury, 4.02% there. The 2 years at 3.98%. So yields moving higher here. And I don't know when does this oil number become a problem, Alex?
Not yet.
$77 a barrel for WTI crude oil. So we'll keep on.
But it has made a very big move in a very short amount of time, and no one likes to see that kind of volatility in general. All right, we'll talk more about the bond market in just a moment. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Alex Steele, Paul Sweeney. We are live in Rainy, Orlando, Florida. We are live from the Commonwealth National Conference for their financial advisors in Orlando, Florida. All right, folks, it is Hispanic Heritage Month, and every day at this time, we are celebrating significant moments in Hispanic heritage. Now, with your installment for October 7th, here's Bloomberg's Sebastian Escobar.
On this day in 1998, after a year of judicial political obstruction by Senate Republicans, Judge Sonia Sotomayor ultimately received her commission to a seat on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. Judge Sotomayor began her career in 1992 as a judge for the Southern District of New York, becoming the first Hispanic federal judge in New York State and first Puerto Rican woman to serve as a judge in a U.S. federal court. Over her 10 years on the Second Circuit, Judge Sotomayor heard appeals in more than 3,000 cases and wrote about 380 opinions when she was in the majority. Then on May 26, 2009, President Barack Obama announced this.
After completing this exhaustive process, I have decided to nominate Judge Sonia Sotomayor of the great state of New York.
Judge Sotomayor became the first Hispanic to ever serve on the Supreme Court, and to this day continued to serve as a role model of inspiration for the Hispanic community throughout the country. That's Today in Hispanic Heritage. I'm Sebastian Escobar, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, thanks so much, Sebastian. I really appreciate that. Okay, let's get to a great article that's reading high on the Bloomberg terminal that I don't think I totally understand. So the title is 100% yields, which automatically that sentence makes me go, huh? Are fueling a retail boom in a new quick buck ETF. So I'm guessing we're looking at some ETFs that have a nice yield, that are drawing in a lot of money. So I want to get more on that. Vildana Hyrick joins us. She's cross-asset reporter for Bloomberg News. Vildana, 100% yields, what is that about?
So we've really seen a proliferation of these types of ETFs. Some people might call them maybe more complex ETFs, derivatives-based ETFs, and we can divide them into a couple different categories. So two of the categories that we looked at in the story, one are these high-yielding ETFs. Basically, they give you a steady stream of income. They pay out sometimes on a weekly or a monthly basis. And another flavor of them that we mentioned in the story are single stock ETFs that give you sort of levered or sometimes inverse returns for a single company like Tesla or Nvidia. And they've become really popular with the retail community, which is why we wanted to write this story and look into this trend, because the companies that are putting out these products, the ETF issuers, are sort of quietly putting them out. At first, you know, it's one or two funds from any one of these companies. Now suddenly we're seeing filings where they are listing 20, 25 ETFs in one filing. So we're really seeing a great proliferation of them. It's attracting the retail community, people who are really interested in these yields and getting those streams of payouts, and then, you know, using those payouts sometimes to pay off their mortgages, for example, or for their everyday life expenses. So it really is interesting. It's proliferating, and there's a great discussion about how risky or not risky some of these funds can be.
So that kind of brings me to my point, Vildana. This seems too good to be true. Are they too good to be true? Are we seeing some problem funds?
There's so many of them. There's more than 160 new ones so far this year, which is a record. Wow. We've really seen the AUM in these funds ballooning to more than $300 billion at this point. But when you look at a lot of them, they might be giving you the payouts, and the payouts are definitely real. But the funds themselves will, for example, underperform the stock or the index. A lot of times they'll underperform by a good chunk the stock or the index that they are tracking. So for example, maybe the Tesla one or the Nvidia one, Tesla might be down for the year, and then one of those funds tracking it will be down even more. So there are some trade-offs, obviously. For a lot of retail investors, it's a secondary consideration that some of these funds are trailing by that much. What's important to them are those income streams, those payouts, and so it's a really interesting juxtaposition to think about.
Yeah, definitely. No doubt about that. Thank you so much, Phil Donna. We appreciate it. Vidal Hyrick joining us from Bloomberg News. It's today's Big Take, so you can definitely check it out on Bloomberg.com/Big Take. Definitely check that out. Plus, it's a podcast, so you can check it out on that as well. Hey, guess what? Category 5 is now Hurricane Milton. Did you see this?
I saw that.
National Hurricane Center now saying that Hurricane Milton, which is barreling towards the west coast of Florida, is now a tropical 5? Category 5. Category 5
Yep.
hurricane storm. We will be, of course, tracking that. There have been potentially the largest evacuation from Tampa and areas in 7 years, so we will keep our eyes on that for you as well. Paul and I are in Orlando. It looks pretty calm here as we head into that, but obviously once the hurricane makes landfall, once it gets there, it will also decrease in speed, but that cone is what they call it. How wide it can be will be quite wide, which means a lot of flooding, a lot of rain, and a lot of wind, and a lot of damage could happen regardless. What did Matt Palzoa say? Like tens of billions and billions in terms of insured losses, and then we're not even looking at the uninsured losses.
Right, and as he questioned, the expectation is by the time it hits landfall, due to some local weather conditions, it might be a little bit weaker than the Category 5. That's kind of the hope. But you're right, the cone of possible landfall is pretty wide at this point. So I think from what we hear in Orlando, the folks down here, they've been through this before. They know what to do. They just unfortunately had to deal with a really bad one to the north here that went up to the Carolinas. So they are used to this stuff, and they are preparing. And we're here.
We will be here, and we will be here tomorrow as well, broadcasting from the Commonwealth's National Conference for Financial Advisors. It's The Future is Now. We will be back here tomorrow at 10 a.m. as well. Futures a little bit heavy, volume a little bit light. Joe Matthew, Balance of Power, up next.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
It's October 7th, and the impact is still unfolding 1 year later. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as the deadliest day in Israel's history resonates from the Middle East to Washington to the presidential campaign. We'll be talking with Democratic Congressman Brad Schneider coming up, a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, co-chair of the Abraham Accords Caucus. We'll hit the campaign trail with former Pennsylvania Congressman Charlie Dent just a couple days after Donald Trump returned to Butler with the likes of Elon Musk. And we'll have analysis from our signature panel. This Monday, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are both with us, and all the stories I mentioned are hanging over the financial markets. Let's start, as always, with a walk on Wall Street. For that, we turn to Charlie Pellet in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Well, hello there, Joe Matthew. Good day from New York with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, Russell 2000, all in the red right now. Stocks are falling as traders trim bets on Fed rate cuts, sending Treasury 10-year yields above 4%. Brent crude soaring to almost $81 a barrel now as mounting tensions in the Mideast raise speculation that Israel may attack Iran's oil infrastructure. Right to the numbers, S&P down 19, 57.31, a drop there of 0.3%. The Dow down 214, lower by 0.5. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 68 for NASDAQ, a drop right now of 0.4%. 10-year, 4.02%. We've got the 2-year, 3.99%. Gold is down $7 the ounce, 26.46, drop there of 0.3%. I mentioned the surge in crude. West Texas Intermediate, 77.20 a barrel right now, up 3.8%. Brent, 80.84 barrel of Brent, the global benchmark, up now by 3.6%. As for the overall market backdrop, Seema Shah is Chief Global Strategist at Principal Asset Management.
I think that there is room for a melt up into November. The only thing which is restricting it is the fact that valuations are really extended. So I don't think you're going to see the same kind of moves you saw in 2023 or early 24. But certainly this is an upward move.
Seema Shah of Principal Asset Management. A rare analyst downgrade for Amazon. Shares are trading lower. Amazon down 2.6% right now. Wells Fargo Securities cut the stock to equal weight from overweight, citing concerns over margin trends into next year. which growth in the cloud computing business is likely to compensate for. Again, we do have shares of Amazon down now by 2.7%. Recapping, stocks lower, S&P down 0.4% for on-demand news 24 hours a day. Subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. I hope you had a good weekend, and thanks for joining us here on the Monday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube as we track the path here of Milton. If you're just joining us today on Bloomberg Radio, and if you're just looking at your terminal, we've got a red headline, now Category 5. This is real. Milton rapidly intensifying into a Cat 5 hurricane, according to the National Hurricane Center, set for landfall in Florida, likely in the Tampa region on Wednesday. Now, as we continue the conversation about Hurricane Helene, the cleanup efforts, the recovery, and whether there should be a supplemental budget request, emergency funding coming out of Washington, this is about to get more complicated. Cat 5 now on the heels of Helene. We'll be talking about this much more as we get closer to Wednesday. As we start the week here on this 7th of October, of course, the conversation is about Israel, the security of Israelis, and a widening conflict, an escalating conflict on multiple fronts throughout the Middle East, something that the U.S. seems to have less influence over now than maybe at any point in the last year. Just wrapped up an event at the White House, the President, First Lady, lighting the yahrzeit candle, joined by a rabbi in the Blue Room. Incidentally, the president getting a hurricane briefing now on the heels of that event. But Kamala Harris and the second gentleman also marking the day here, delivering remarks and planting a memorial tree, a pomegranate tree, which is a traditional move here at the vice president's residence. That'll be up at the Naval Observatory around 4 o'clock. So on the late edition of Balance of Power, we'll be hearing some remarks likely from Kamala Harris. Donald Trump is in New York commemorating this on his own here. He'll be holding a remembrance event at Trump National Doral in Miami at the end of the day. That'll be about 6 p.m. Eastern Time, as we follow the movements of the candidates, of course. But we have news coming out of Israel right now. Hamas firing rockets at Israel amid clashes after a year of war. We spend so much time talking about what's going on in Lebanon. Of course, the cross-border exchanges continue. Airstrikes have been hitting Beirut for days now, and we want to get the latest on what's actually happening with the help of Rosalind Matheson, Bloomberg News Director for Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Rosalind, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining us here and for staying up late. I know this is a very busy time for all of the areas in which you cover. But the fact of the matter is, you can tell us now, a widening conflict is how we describe this 1 year later. What's happening on the ground in Israel today?
Well, that's right. So it is, in fact, a widening conflict. And the events today are really a reminder of that, because in a way, the attention had shifted a bit towards Lebanon and the ground, incursion that's gone on there from Israel, the fighting that's happening against Hezbollah. But Israel is really fighting on those multiple fronts. And what we've seen today, the 1 year mark of the Hamas attack on Israel a year ago, is that, Hamas is still a fighting force despite a year of war. It's lobbed a bunch of rockets over into Israel today, including some that were targeted at Tel Aviv. Most of those have been shot down, but a few did get through. We've also seen Israel, turn its focus back a bit to Gaza in recent days. So we've seen Israeli troops moving back into the north of Gaza. Those were areas that was ostensibly, cleaned out of a large part of Hamas some time ago. We're also seeing, of course, action in the center of Gaza. So really a signal, from that is that Israel's very bogged down in a way in both these fronts, and really, the concern is about the security of its borders in all those directions.
It is pretty remarkable to have sirens sounding across central Israel on this day of days. Rosalind, the IDF says it intercepted most of the projectiles fired from the Palestinian territory, but you're right, this is still a two-front situation, and I wonder what's going to happen next when it comes to Iran. This is still an Israel that is crouched and prepared to respond.
Well, that's right, and we're still waiting for a response from Israel. It's obviously something that's being carefully considered. You need to send a proportional response at the least. to Iran, because the latest volley that came from Iran was ballistic missiles only. So they came a lot faster. Yeah. They came with a lot less warning than previously, and some of them got through. And so Israel can't just respond in the way that it did back in April when we had that tit for tat between Iran and Israel. They've got to consider something that sends a message. And it looks like, of course, there are three options here. One is to hit the nuclear sites, which the US has very much warned against, and Israel arguably can't do on its own militarily. You've got the oil sites in Iran, which is obviously spooking the oil market, because again, then you're getting into issues around global supply and the economy. Or do you go again for military targets across Iran, but in a much more fulsome way than you did back in April? These are all the calculations in this chessboard that we're in about how do you do this to send messages to each other without tipping it into a full-blown direct conflict between Iran and Israel. So we're waiting to see, what Israel does there. And then, of course, does that in turn bring another, reaction from Iran itself?
Yeah. Really glad you could join us live from London. Rosalind Matheson with us here on Balance of Power, Bloomberg News Director for Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Quite an area of responsibility at this time in our history. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. As we hear some new remarks from Kamala Harris on the situation in Israel. She sat down for an interview with 60 Minutes. This is not something that you would have seen last night. It's actually part of their election special that will air later today. This is the special we talked about that Donald Trump chose to not take part in. And they did speak about the situation in Israel. The vice president was asked about the veracity of our alliance between Washington and Benjamin Netanyahu. Here's how she answered.
I think, with all due respect, the better question is, do we have an important alliance between the American people and the Israeli people? And the answer to that question is yes.
Kamala Harris out with a statement on this October 7, much like Joe Biden. Each separate statements. Vice President Harris calling the Hamas attack a year ago today pure evil, reiterating her commitment to the security of Israel as unwavering. That's a quote. Also saying she is heartbroken over the scale and death and destruction in Gaza. It's where we pick up our conversation with Brad Schneider, Congressman, Democrat, representing Illinois' 10th District and a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He's also co-founder, co-chair of the Abraham Accords Caucus. Congressman, thank you for being with us on such an important day. This is obviously something that is not becoming more quiet. It's escalating. And I wonder if you see any chance that this will be resolved by the election on November 5th.
Well, thank you for having me, and it is a very auspicious day. It was exactly 1 year ago where Hamas launched thousands of terrorists, thousands of rockets, killing 1,200, taking 250 hostage, and leading to the conflict we've seen over the past year. It's hard to imagine that a resolution is on the near horizon. As was mentioned, I don't think I'd call it a widening conflict in the region. Hezbollah started firing rockets at Israel on October 8th. The Houthis from Yemen, Iran has launched 2 strikes in April and on October 1st. It's certainly escalating, and it's hard to imagine that it'll be resolved within the next 4 weeks. But the United States, as you just had Vice President Harris said very clearly, the United States stands united with Israel, the people of Israel, in their fight, existential battle against the Iran and its proxies. And we need to make sure that Israel defeats Hamas, defeats Hezbollah, and that ultimately we can get onto that road for peace where all the people in the region can give their children the future they deserve.
Well, with all of that said here, you're attending and speaking at an event in Highland Park today, honoring those murdered and taken hostage on October 7th. I wonder if we have moved on from the idea of an agreement that would secure the release of the rest of the living hostages. As we learned today, another Israeli hostage has been confirmed dead. We talk so much about the two-front conflict that's happening, the potential for a ceasefire. We don't talk enough, Congressman, about the hostages who are still being held.
No, you're right. And I hadn't heard about the confirmation of another hostage killed. There's 101 hostages in Gaza, people who were taken from Israel on October 7th. We know that many of those are no longer living. It doesn't change the fact that until they are returned, their bodies are returned, the families can't get closure, can't bury their loved ones and observe the mourning period that they all rightly should be able to observe. And we know that some, hopefully many, are still living. The goal is to get them home as quickly as possible. I've worn this yellow ribbon now for 367 days, hoping to bring the hostages home, hoping for a pathway. It rests with Yahya Sinwar. He has the ability to release the hostages, to bring this war to an end in Gaza, to free the people of Gaza, to rebuild and renew their lives and their communities, but renew it in a way free from the terrorist infrastructure that Hamas has built and the terrorist threats against Israel.
Well, Congressman, as I mentioned, you're a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. What will be the U.S. commitment militarily here to help defend Israel if this continues to escalate? We know that Israel is working on a response to Iran right now, and we've surged an enormous number of military equipment, thousands of troops to the Middle East. What are we preparing for?
Well, I think we have to be prepared to confront Iran. Iran launched almost 200 ballistic missiles at Israel a week ago tomorrow. It was an escalation unlike anything we've seen in the region before. Thankfully, with U.S. support and others, Israel was able to thwart the attack, second time in a year, in less than a year. And the response against Iran, as President Biden said, it needs to be proportionate. 180 ballistic missiles is not a small strike, it's a major strike. It targeted all 10 million people living in Israel. Israel needs to restore its deterrence, as it's done with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And we need to get to a place where the regime understands that they don't have a free hand. They continue to support terrorism in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Yemen. They're a disruptive influence. Iran is a disruptive influence to the region, to the interests of peace in the region, as well as the interests of the United States. So I expect in Congress, as well as the administration, stands by Israel, our most important ally in the region, but also stands with our other allies in confronting the existential threat that Iran poses.
You know what's interesting to me, Congressman, is that the analysis always leads us to the point where we hear that nobody wants to go to war. Israel is not looking to go to war with Iran, and Iran is not looking to go to war with Israel. Everyone's trying to save face. And when this tit-for-tat continues, they feel no option but to respond. And with that said, as Israel prepares to respond to Iran, now once again, if you see any diplomatic off-ramps or if this really is only a military solution.
Well, at the end of the day, there has to be a diplomatic solution. It has to be Iran reversing course. They are moving towards a nuclear weapon. The policy of the United States, the right and correct policy of the United States is that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. That is a policy shared by not just Israel, but our allies in the region, our Arab allies in the region. And so it'd be far better to get to a diplomatic solution without having to take other measures for Iran to back away, to get back in compliance with an agreement that said they wouldn't enrich uranium to highly enriched near weapons grade levels, that they would allow inspectors in to ensure that their nuclear program is a civilian nuclear program and not a military program. There's every reason to believe that it is a military program, and the United States, working with our allies, has to be prepared to do everything necessary to ensure that Iran can never have that nuclear weapon they so desire.
Congressman Schneider, I started our conversation by asking you if you thought this might resolve by the election. I don't think you do, and I don't think anyone does at this point. So in our remaining minute here, I wish we had more time, but in our minute left, will the result of the election here in the United States help to determine the outcome of what's happening in the Middle East?
Well, thanks. I'm happy to come back and talk more about this. I think the results of the election will have a significant impact. President Biden, to his credit, has stood by Israel longer than any previous U.S. president in a time of war. He's the only president to have visited Israel during a time of war. It's imperative that the United States remains committed to Israel's right to defend itself, to secure its borders, protect its citizens, and as we talked about at the beginning, to rescue the hostages. We need to make sure that the United States continues to lead on a global stage, that we stay engaged with our allies, that we strengthen the alliances like NATO, like other alliances, build on the Abraham Accords, and stay.
Well, thank you for
at the
engaging with us
forefront of the
today,
world.
Congressman. Let's get more time next time. Brad Schneider, Democrat from Illinois, with us on this 7th of October. This is Bloomberg.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long. Here at Bloomberg, we begin with an update on Hurricane Milton. It has strengthened into a catastrophic Category 5 hurricane as it bears down on Florida's west coast, where residents have begun to flee inland in a region still recovering from Helene's devastation. The National Hurricane Center out with an update roughly 30 minutes ago saying Milton's top winds have now reached 160 miles an hour. That is up from 90 miles an hour at 1 a.m. Orange juice futures now up by almost 4% as Hurricane Milton approaches Florida. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all trading in the red right now. S&P down 20, a drop there of 0.4% to 5730. We've got the Dow Jones Industrial Average down 247, down 0.6%. NASDAQ down 57, a decline of 0.3%. 10-year 4.02% with the 2-year that's yielding 3.98%. Gold, spot gold down $9 the ounce, $26.44, decline of 0.3%. West Texas Intermediate crude now surging 3.3%, $76.88 a barrel. Brent up 3.2%, back above 80 right now at $80.53. Sources tell Bloomberg activist investor Starboard Value has taken a stake of about $1 billion in Pfizer and is seeking to spur a turnaround of the struggling pharmaceuticals giant. Again, recapping, the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the red. S&P down now by 33 points, a decline of just about 0.2%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Balance of Power continues. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Charlie Pellet, live in New York on Balance of Power every day here, part of our program as we cover politics that keeps tabs on the markets for us. And boy, we're watching the price of oil here for more reasons than one now, not just what's happening in the Middle East, of course, the situation with yet another hurricane approaching now our Gulf Coast. This is happening again. Milton, Cat 5, redhead on the terminal, this noontime hour, East Coast, on the 7th of October. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Glad you're with us here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube, where you can always find us. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. If you don't know the drill, make this part of your routine. It's pretty cool. We have our live stream going all day on YouTube from New York and from Washington, where we're broadcasting now. There was no mistaking the second rally in Butler and the difference between the second rally and the first one. Butler, Pennsylvania, Donald Trump back, at this time in a glass box. Of course, prompted by the assassination attempt that took place upon his first visit to the farm in Butler. He came back to mark the spot where the campaign changed in July. And he had a very famous man with him. The richest man in the world decided to show up. We knew he would be there, Elon Musk. And as we asked out loud here on this program on Friday, would he actually speak to the crowd? Would he come up on the stage, stand at the podium? You know Donald Trump's going to call him up there. And yes, it happened. Here is Elon Musk from Saturday in Butler.
President Trump must win to preserve the Constitution. He must win to preserve democracy in America. This is a must-win situation. Must win. So I have one ask for everyone in the audience, everyone who watches this video, everyone in the live stream. There's one request. It's very important. Register to vote.
He got up there with the black hat. If you're with us on YouTube, you see the black MAGA hat. He's called himself Dark MAGA. Although he was lighter than air, if you watched the event, literally 2 feet off the ground, jumping up and down with his arms up in the air as the crowd went wild. Charlie Dent is back with us, the former Republican congressman from Pennsylvania, senior advisor to the group Our Republican Legacy. Congressman, it's great to see you. Welcome back. Does Elon Musk bring any new votes, any extra votes to Donald Trump in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I really don't think so. I've never been one to believe that these celebrity endorsements matter that much. Maybe Taylor Swift does because she's a cultural icon and a unique singular figure. But I don't think it really matters. And what I found interesting is that Elon Musk is talking about preserving democracy, and that's of course the argument that Democrats are making about Trump. Each side is claiming that the democracy is on their side, and each is the other side is a threat to democracy. It's really remarkable.
I'm so happy you pointed that out. Congressman, I spent all Sunday morning, because I like to torture myself, watching the Sunday morning news shows. And I saw the likes of Speaker Johnson and many others calling out Democrats. And Donald Trump has blamed Democrats for the assassination attempts that he has withstood because of what you just said, this line that Donald Trump could mean the end of democracy. But as we just heard from Elon Musk, and we hear at every speech from Donald Trump, Kamala Harris would be the end of the country. In fact, Elon Musk said if she was elected, there would never be another election. Can we forget, just move past the double standard here? Both sides are saying this, aren't they?
Well, yeah, what's so incredible about this whole election cycle is that the stakes have been raised so high. Donald Trump and his supporters say we won't have a country anymore if he's not elected. The Democrats say if Trump is elected, we won't have a democracy anymore. And so now we've raised the pitch to such a high fever that we see these radicals coming out now, like we saw in Butler, that disturbed young man who attempted to assassinate Donald Trump. Thankfully, Donald Trump survived that. And then we also had the situation in Florida where the individual down there seemed to be politically motivated. Of course, the Secret Service thwarted that assassination attempt. And so I can see how we have reached this point of political violence or perhaps civil disorder, which could, of course, occur after the election, regardless of outcome. But we've had violence in our political system. We saw that Donald Trump and his supporters did attempt to obstruct the peaceful transfer of power and try to overturn an outcome they did not like. We saw that in leading up to January 6th and certainly on January 6th. Obviously, the system held. But, I mean, you can make a case that Donald Trump did try to overturn a free and fair election.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have been making that case. And we also remember Elon Musk, aforementioned, on his own X, formerly Twitter, musing openly about why no one had tried to assassinate Joe Biden or Kamala Harris following the second one against Donald Trump. But I'll tell you what, Congressman, your state sure is something. We've got new numbers from Emerson College, new polling. This isn't even a one-point race. This is just flat tied. Emerson College polling, Real Clear Pennsylvania survey, 48% of voters support Donald Trump, 48% of voters support Vice President Kamala Harris. Half voters expect Harris to win, 49% expect Trump to win. Is Pennsylvania still the state to decide the election, and what makes it break one way or the other?
Yeah, Pennsylvania is the keystone. It is the battleground state of all battleground states. Muhlenberg College just did a poll. They do good polling, public polling. They did a poll last week, also had it tied, I believe, at 48-48. So this is a dead heat, no matter how you look at this. If you really dissect Pennsylvania, though, Harris needs to do extremely well in the Philadelphia media market, specifically the city of Philadelphia and the 4 collar counties. She needs to run up the numbers there. She needs to do well in the Lehigh Valley, and she will win only a handful of other counties around the state. She'll win Monroe County, probably in the Poconos, Center County, where Penn State is in the middle of the state, and Allegheny County. But the 2 counties to watch in Pennsylvania are Northampton County, my old district, is the ultimate bellwether county in the state and perhaps the nation, and Erie County. Those are the 2 counties. And I'm not big on predictions, but I will say this. I will predict this. Whichever candidate wins Northampton and Erie counties will likely win will win Pennsylvania and will win the presidency. So this state is, if you look at Pennsylvania, east of the Susquehanna River, south and east, it's really more like a northeastern state. And if you look at Pennsylvania, maybe west of the Susquehanna, it's kind of more like a Midwestern state. And so it's a few different states out there, and the issue sets, the economy is always a big issue out in the western part of the state. The eastern part of the state, in many ways, is more prosperous. I think social issues play a more dominant role there.
What was it James Carville said? You've got Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Alabama in the middle. With that said, Congressman, if it's really coming down to Pennsylvania here, why didn't Kamala Harris pick your governor, Shapiro?
Well, that mystified me. I thought, okay, for Kamala Harris, there is no path to her victory without Pennsylvania. Trump, is probably true for Trump, but he has to win Georgia, but probably true for both candidates, but especially for Harris. So I was surprised she didn't select Shapiro because Shapiro was particularly strong in the Philadelphia media market, and he also won in many counties where Joe Biden did not. And Tim Walz, who's a friend, I served him, he's a good man, he basically, if you look at the map of Minnesota, Walz and Biden won in the same places. So Shapiro, I thought, brought more value, and in the state that she must win and where she is, frankly, not performing as well as she needs to. So I thought it was an error that she didn't select him. She obviously had her reasons. In the end, she may win, and she'll look like a genius. But I just thought if Pennsylvania is the ball game, Shapiro could have really helped her because he does present well. He's smart. He's cut a more centrist path and could help her on issues like fracking in Pennsylvania and others where she stumbled a bit.
Interesting. Spending time with former Republican Congressman Charlie Dent, as I mentioned, you're a senior advisor to a group called Our Republican Legacy. And I wonder where your head is looking forward to November. if Donald Trump wins or if he doesn't win. Is this the last stand of MAGA? Will MAGA end with Donald Trump, or is it the new direction of the GOP?
Well, the reason why we exist is at our Republican legacy. We are trying to create that counter argument to MAGA, or a counter narrative. You know, if Trump loses, I think that we will be in a much stronger position to present an alternative case, as we've talked about before, based on core principles like the Constitution, the rule of law. We believe in free and fair elections. We believe in free markets. We are against these ridiculous and destructive tariffs. We believe in peace through strength and a constructive international engagement that embraces allies, that rejects autocrats like Putin. And so we think we can make this argument, and we intend to make this argument not just now, but after the election. And particularly if Trump loses, I believe there are significant numbers of Republicans who want a different direction, as do many other Americans. The principles that we have outlined, our 5 core principles, are ones that have sustained the Republican Party for over 170 years, and we believe they can carry us forward. There's no question about it. And a lot of Republicans need to hear an argument. Too often, Republicans who are critical of Trump, maybe particularly in elected office, they will complain about him behind closed doors, but nobody's hearing that. Silence is not an alternative narrative to MAGA. That's why we have to have a proactive agenda, which is what we are presenting. And we think that and not just Nikki Haley voters, but a lot of people who vote for Donald Trump want something better too. And I think we believe independents and many Democrats will also agree with what we're talking about.
I haven't heard anyone refer to Nikki Haley voters for a minute. Congressman, it's good to see you come back. We only have 4 weeks to go here, and obviously Pennsylvania couldn't be more important. A former Republican Congressman from the great state of Pennsylvania, Charlie Dent. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Our signature panel back together today. We've got Rick and Jeannie following another wild weekend on the campaign trail. We'll get their take on Trump and Musk and Butler and Kamala Harris starting the new media blitz. It starts right now. We'll have a lot more coming up on Bloomberg.
12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Hurricane Milton is now one of the most powerful storms produced in the Atlantic this year. Milton strengthened into a catastrophic Category 5 hurricane as it bears down on Florida's west coast, where residents have begun to flee inland in a region still recovering from Helene's devastation. The National Hurricane Center said about an hour ago that Milton's winds have now reached 160 miles an hour. That is up from 90 miles an hour at 1 a.m. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the red right now. S&P down 24, decline of 0.4%. Stocks lower as traders trim bets on Federal Reserve rate cuts. The Dow down 257, a decline of 0.6%. NASDAQ down 78, a drop of 0.4%. The 10-year, 4.02%. The 2-year, 3.99%. Gold down $9 the ounce, lower by 0.4%, $26.44 right now on gold. While West Texas Intermediate crude up 3.5%, $77.01 a barrel. Brent trading above $80 a barrel, $80.67 on the global benchmark, up now by 3.4%. As for the overall market backdrop, Stuart Kaiser is head of U.S. equity trading at Citigroup Global Markets.
Banks are going to be important, obviously, kind of set the tone for what they're seeing from a credit risk perspective and on the economy. But look, the earnings season is going to be basically October 24th to November 1st, give or take, which is when you get those large cap, tech stocks reporting.
Stuart Kaiser of Citigroup. I mentioned oil higher. ExxonMobil among the stocks advancing today, up 0.9%. BP up by 0.9%. Chevron up now by 0.6%. Recapping, S&P down 24, decline of 0.4%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. And once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
Okay, Charlie, thank you so much. Welcome to the Monday edition of Balance of Power. Indeed, we're live from Washington with our eyes on the campaign trail on this 7th of October. We've heard from both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in statement form, the president holding an event earlier with the First Lady on this solemn occasion to light a yahrzeit candle, a Jewish mourning tradition for the anniversary of a death. Kamala Harris also speaking about the conflict in the Middle East on 60 Minutes. This is the program we discussed. It's going to be on later today, 8 o'clock, I believe, Eastern time. On CBS, the show that Donald Trump could have had half of but chose to not take part in. And I understand from what we've been told, CBS News will explain the backstory there. But this is a full hour of media, prime time for Kamala Harris, and Tim Walz takes part as well. They cover a lot of ground, I'm told. We'll find out together. And a couple of moments from the interview have been released, including some of Kamala Harris's comments about Israel. Let's listen.
The work that we do diplomatically with the leadership of Israel is an ongoing pursuit around making clear our principles, which include the need for humanitarian aid, the need for this war to end, the need for a deal to be done, which would release the hostages and create a ceasefire.
Let's assemble our signature panel. Jeannie Shanzano is back with us. Of course, Bloomberg Politics contributor, political science professor at Iona University, and senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick Davis back as well, Republican strategist, partner at Stone Court Capital, and yes, Bloomberg Politics contributor. Great to see you both. I hope you both had a great weekend. Jeannie, I'm talking about the Democratic administration here and the Democratic nominee for president. Both, of course, choosing their words very carefully at a very delicate moment and a solemn day here, of course, for Israelis, remembering this is the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. It was the deadliest day in Israel's history. This is something the next president of the United States will have to help solve, correct?
Yes, if they can solve it, and that goes for both sides. And of course, it's really hard to talk politics on this really solemn day, as you just mentioned, but this issue is really dominating the campaign trail today, and of course, the White House. And so, I've heard the clips from Kamala Harris on 60 Minutes You know, I've been looking at what people have said about it. It doesn't seem that it satisfies anyone. I'm a bit surprised that that's how they let her go out with this. On the other hand, what else would she be able to say? Because this issue is a real problem for Kamala Harris in the same way it was for Joe Biden, and quite frankly, the same way it has been for incumbent presidents going back almost to the founding of Israel, but, you know, at least back 30 or 40 years. It's a really challenging issue. It's a no-win situation for her. And let's not forget, we're talking October 7th, but the situation has gotten worse for the Democrats in the last 2 weeks, because now it involves Lebanon directly. And of course, the Lebanese American population in the swing state of Michigan is the largest in America. And so it has been compounded. It has not gotten any better while she's been on the campaign trail in the last, 2 months.
Yeah. The vice president's words are being scrutinized, Rick, as you would expect, as people try to find any difference between her approach and Joe Biden's. How's she doing?
I think she's not letting too much daylight in between her approach and Joe Biden's, which I'm a little surprised by, because I would have thought this would be one of the areas that she would have tried to draw a contrast for all the reasons that Jeannie was just talking about, because there are constituencies at play. There are, major groups like the Arab Americans in Michigan that we talk about quite a bit, who have not been happy with the Joe Biden administration on not just even their actions toward Israel, but their lack of outreach toward the community. So I would have thought this would have been sort of an important moment for her, not today particularly, but since she has been the candidate of the Democratic Party, to say, well, I might approach it differently in the future and maybe put some principles together on how she feels, the conduct of this war should take place, which is not substantially different than what Joe Biden's been doing. But if she created some distance, I think it walks her a long way to getting those voters in Michigan to coalesce around her, which they simply haven't done in the numbers that they gave to Biden in 2020.
Jeannie, what are voters supposed to think about the differences? Let's stop with Joe Biden for a moment, between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. What would these two administrations bring differently in their approach to helping to solve this?
Yeah, and I think that it's a great question, because I think that's the problem for many of those who voted, say, uncommitted in the Democratic primary, for Arab Americans, quite frankly, for many young Americans looking at this situation on the Democratic side. They don't see daylight between Biden and now Harris and Trump. And in fact, when I've heard from voters, what they have said is that while Kamala Harris's rhetoric and her remembrance of and her concern for, rhetorically, the Palestinians in Gaza and now people living in Lebanon who have been in large numbers impacted by this war. The rhetoric is a lot better, they claim, than Joe Biden's rhetoric was, and certainly Donald Trump's. They aren't hearing any specific policy differences when it comes to weapons, when it comes to alliances. The 60-minute clip has been described as sidestepping the issue on Benjamin Netanyahu. And let's not forget, Benjamin Netanyahu is one of the least popular leaders around the world for Democrats. And so they want to hear that she has this different approach that Rick was just talking about, and they haven't heard that yet. Hence, they decided after the debate, we're not going to endorse her. Good news for Kamala Harris, if there is a silver lining, they're not endorsing either Trump or Stein. But that's a problem in a state like Michigan, which is going to be won by a few thousand votes. I mean, 10,000 is the problem for Hillary Clinton. And you look at the numbers, they voted uncommitted in Wisconsin and Michigan in the primary, and that bests that many times over. So it is a problem for Democrats. And I would also just add, really interesting polling out of New York on Donald Trump. For everything people have said he has said about that it sounds anti-Semitic, he is enjoying larger numbers of support amongst Jewish New Yorkers than many Republicans in the past. And so, there is a real challenge here for Democrats.
Jeannie made reference to what Kamala Harris said about Benjamin Netanyahu, asked about our relationship with Netanyahu during this 60 Minutes interview. It's one of the other snippets that we got as a preview here. Rick, let's actually listen to her words. Here's Kamala Harris.
I think
with all due respect, the better question is, do we have an important alliance between the American people and the Israeli people? And the answer to that question is yes.
Rick Davis, how do you read into that answer, and what would it mean for our relationship with Netanyahu if she's elected?
You know, I think that our relationship with Netanyahu is going to be needing a new definition no matter who's elected. Obviously, Donald Trump will put a filter through it that is different than what Kamala Harris will do. But I think the Biden relationship is so damaged it may be beyond repair. And we have to remember, too, that Bibi Netanyahu is damaged within his own population may be beyond repair. So it may be that the opening that the next president has, regardless of who it is going to be with a new prime minister, because the sustainability post-war of Bibi Netanyahu's political career is, highly suspect. So I think it's not a linear decision on like who's going to get along with Bibi. The question is, can Bibi survive a political challenge? And if so, what does that mean for his relationship with the United States? And I think that it is a very defining thing for the entire Middle East, because there have been lots of efforts by us in the United States to create a bridge to Israel and the rest of the Gulf states. And it's been put on pause during this, military effort. And I think that until we see the end of that, none of that's going to take root again. So I think this is one of the big questions that's going to be answered only after war fighting and only after the Israeli people decide who they want as a leader in a post-Bibi Netanyahu administration.
Really smart conversation with our signature panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. That clip, or the couple of clips we've been playing from 60 Minutes, special airs tonight, just the beginning here of what's going to be a massive media blitz by Kamala Harris over the next 48 hours. Jeannie, that was recorded over the weekend, as was an interview with Call Her Daddy, the podcast that's actually making some waves. We'll have some snippets of that in our next hour, talking about reproductive rights and the idea of Donald Trump as a protector of women. But then tomorrow she's on to New York. She's going to do The View. She's going to do the Howard Stern show, and then Stephen Colbert at night. So what do you make of this path, Jeannie? Instead of sitting down with the so-called hard-hitting news people, she's talking with interviewers of cultural significance, and I think we could argue maybe friends of the family.
Yeah, that's right. And people called for her to do more interviews. She's heeding that call. But of course, given the media situation today, she is going to a bunch of these sort of more niche, if you will, although Call Her Daddy, Howard Stern, they get millions and millions of viewers and listeners. Yeah. So she is listening to the call from people who said she hasn't done enough interviews. I think it is a smart strategy. Call Her Daddy is particularly appealing to young women, but I would say she also did a podcast not a few days ago with two former NBA players, which appeals very much to young men in the same way Donald Trump has been doing. So they are spreading her all over, trying to get her message out. And of course, we can't forget about the all-important Univision. The one we want to see on that list, Joe Matthew, is we want to see her come to Balance of Power and talk to you and Kaylee's.
Well,
she's just got to add that stuff in.
Yeah, it's all policy over here, though. I don't know if they want to talk about that, but openly invited. Rick, just a minute left. Is this enough to do these kinds of interviews?
I think it's time that she's doing these kinds of interviews. It's not enough. She's going to have to keep this pace up. 28 days to go before the election is over. So the clock is not her friend. But I do think it's a sign also of the future, which is influencers, podcasts, talk show hosts carry more weight to voters than the networks. Believe me, if the networks were definitive on their ability to influence the vote, she'd be on the networks more often. So I think you follow the eyeballs, and in this case, it's telling us a lot about what the future of politics is going to look like.
Isn't that something? There's a lot of truth there. We're not afraid to say it out loud. And Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano will be back with us in our second hour. We're going to touch more on the Harris Media Blitz. Tim Walz is part of it as well. and some of the other stories impacting the conversation today. It's all coming up next. In our second hour of Balance of Power, stay with us here on Bloomberg Radio as we welcome our global television audience to the conversation, and Kaylee Lyons will be jumping in as well. Live from Washington, stay with us right here on the fastest show in politics. This is Bloomberg.
business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Counting the cost of the candidates' proposals. Welcome to the fastest show in politics, with new research out today on what the Trump and Harris tax plans would mean for debt and deficits. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. Welcome to the Monday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Kaylee, it's great to see you. Hope you had a great weekend. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget up with new numbers today that will probably not make the markets very happy.
No, these are big, big figures for both candidates, frankly. $3.5 trillion added to the deficit is the estimate at the median for what a Kamala Harris administration could ultimately look like. The central estimate for Donald Trump, $7.5 trillion, and the high end is what is really astounding, up to $15.2 trillion.
Eye-watering numbers, if you're to believe them, and the committee does this for a living. So it becomes a pick your poison, I guess, when it comes to debt and deficits. And we're going to drill down with Maya McGinnis, who had a very busy weekend crunching numbers for us here, Kaylee, on what is also October 7th, and a solemn date that is something that we cannot remove from politics here in Washington.
Nope, it's been 1 year since the attack on Israel by Hamas, which of course killed over 1,000, led to hundreds being taken hostage. We have seen the deaths of many of those hostages over the last 12 months. And of course, both President Biden and Kamala Harris, Donald Trump too, for that matter, are marking this sober 1 year mark in their own ways today. President Biden just within the last hour lighting a candle at the White House.
Yeah, that's right. And Nick Wadhams will join us from our national security team. There is firing, shelling from the Palestinian region, Gaza, into Israel today. And it looks like they knocked most of them down. But we have to remember Hamas. It's not just Hezbollah and Iran that we're talking about here.
Yeah, there are many different fronts that we're following. And the escalating tension, of course, in the Middle East is what has led oil prices higher. I believe we're at $80 a barrel on Brent once again. So let's get a check on those figures and the other latest in the equity markets. Charlie Pellet has a look from New York.
Hi, thank you very much. Happy Monday. We have got the price of Brent crude, as you mentioned, above 80, was closing in on 81 a few moments ago. 80.66, where a barrel of Brent stands right now, up by 3.4%. WTI traded here in New York. West Texas Intermediate crude 77.02, up by 3.5%. Stocks right now in the red, with the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all declining. S&P down 24, decline now of 0.4%. The Dow down 228, drop there of 0.5%. NASDAQ lower by 81, a decline of 0.5%. Stocks are lower as traders trim bets on Fed rate cuts, sending 10-year yields back above 4%. The 10-year right now 4.01%, with a 2-year that's yielding 3.98%. Spot gold down $6, little change now, down by about 0.3%, 26.46 for an ounce of the precious metal. Keeping an eye on Lucid Motors. Lucid Group's electric vehicle production dropped in the third quarter. It did miss analyst forecasts, but deliveries exceeded expectations. That's what investors are focused on now, with shares of Lucid climbing 1.9%. Among other EV makers, Rivian down 1.2%, Tesla tumbling by 2%. Again, recapping, 10-year worth repeating 4.01%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 3.4%, 76.90 for a barrel of WTI. S&P down by 0.4%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News now wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. The Monday edition, back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Limes.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. This is the Monday edition of Balance of Power. Thank you for joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio. But of course, this isn't just like any other Monday. This is the Monday when we are marking 1 year since the October 7th attack on Israel by Hamas. And of course, over the course of the last 12 months, we have seen ongoing war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Hamas firing fresh fire at Israel today. Largely, those missiles sent at Tel Aviv were intercepted. But of course, we also are seeing, Joe, no longer just fighting in Gaza, but other regions as well, as Israel is continuing to conduct its strike operations in southern Lebanon against Hezbollah, another Iranian proxy.
Yeah, that's right. We've continued to see cross-border skirmishes and airstrikes against Beirut, but also Hamas firing rockets at Israel from Gaza. So the fact that we are at this solemn date does not mean that fighting is stopping or even pausing here. And we want to talk about this with Nick Wadhams, who runs our national security coverage here out of Washington. It's great to see you, Nick. This is a precarious moment, and I wonder what this day means for Iran and the proxies that have been attacking Israel.
Well, there's so many uncertainties right now. I mean, the big issue, obviously, is that Israel has threatened to retaliate against Iran after its missile barrage a week ago. So we are all waiting to see what happens. Obviously, the signals are very cloudy. We don't really know what Israel will do, how severe they will go, but also given the fact, as you mentioned, they are essentially keeping up attacks on Hamas and Hezbollah. So, we just saw an alert come across the system that Israel is telling people to move out of some of the coastal southern areas in Lebanon in advance of likely strikes there. So it looks like the Israeli attacks on Hezbollah are only widening. I think it's just an extraordinarily sad and challenging moment to think that, this all started a year ago, and here we are. This campaign is getting even more intense as Israel looks to eliminate Hamas and Hezbollah for good.
Well, and this also marks a full year being held hostage for many individuals that are still being held by Hamas. Obviously, there has been domestic pressure on Netanyahu to reach some kind of agreement to bring those hostages home. Do we have a sense of whether or not that is moving forward at all, as we're still seeing the fighting on multiple fronts?
At the moment, it appears there is absolutely no progress on the hostages. There had been talk some weeks ago about the possibility that we were inching toward a ceasefire. I mean, it's been moving in fits and starts, but what it really seems like right now is a ceasefire is just in neither side's immediate interest, at least militarily. I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu says he wants to get the hostages home, but he also wants to continue to prosecute this war against Hamas, and you can't do both. You can't have a ceasefire that allows the hostages to return while also continuing that war. Hamas also, I think, understands that if it loses those hostages, it loses a point of leverage. There would be absolutely no reason for Israel to negotiate with Hamas if there were no hostages. So it's a terrible tragedy. We're in a situation where it feels like there has absolutely been no progress. I think the U.S. officials are extremely skeptical that anything would happen on a Hamas ceasefire deal anytime soon. And that is partly why you also see Israel shifting to Hezbollah. They do not see any sort of conversation or about restraint with Hamas as being a priority.
We talk about the presidential race, of course, every day here on this program. And it does make you wonder if the next president, whether it's Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, will inherit this conflict at its lowest stage here.
Certainly, it's been as tense as I can recall it being in the last year, especially given that Israel says it's not going to settle for just a limited message-sending kind of strike against Iran, that it's likely to be something much more severe. So that is a deep concern. And then you have the whole U.S. element. I mean, obviously, everybody's going to say, okay, Trump says this wouldn't have happened on my watch. It's not clear to me what either of them would be able to do once they come into office to stop this thing, because Israel has shown over the last year that it is going to do exactly what it feels compelled to do without the approval of the U.S. and sometimes in direct opposition to what the U.S. wants.
Well, the next president may also be tasks with signing, for example, supplemental funding for Israel. As we talk about them intercepting rockets sent today by Hamas, of course, having to intercept the missile barrage that was sent by Iran last week, are we getting closer to a time at which in Israel's stockpiles of both defensive and offensive weaponry are going to need to be replenished by the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, they get a fair number of their weapons that do not rely on the U.S. and on that supplemental funding. Israel does have stocks, but I think that is not a huge concern at the moment, at least because there's such broad bipartisan support for Israel. There are some senators, some lawmakers who are calling for a restriction on weapons and ammunition sales to Israel, particularly those big 2,000-pound bombs that it's dropped in some cases. But generally speaking, there are no real voices who have any power who could stop this thing. So the only challenge, I think, would be is if you have Israel funding somehow linked to Ukraine funding, because then it really would slow down, because there is so much opposition to another supplemental for Ukraine. But I would suspect the Israel money will continue pretty much uninterrupted.
All right, Nick Wadhams leading our national security coverage here in Washington. Thank you, and thank you for your coverage over the last year. It's hard to believe that it's now been 12 months. And to Nick's point, we did see in the last supplemental package Israel and Ukraine funding and funding for the Asia Pacific as well, all of it attached together. And there is a question of how these will be addressed going forward when sorting out any kind of funding here in Washington, as we know, is quite difficult.
And this, again, is why So many defense hawks did not want that 6-month CR to bring us into March without the opportunity to enhance funding. Whether there is an emergency request has yet to be seen, but this could be a very interesting lame duck as we also wait for another Category 5 hurricane.
Well, that's absolutely true. Milton now barreling toward the Gulf Coast of Florida once again. So as we have these conversations around funding and look forward to what kind of funding the picture will be in 2025, we want to bring in now Maya McGinnis, who, of course, is at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, where she serves as president, because the committee put out today a fiscal impact paper on the potential Harris and Trump presidencies based on their campaign plans. And these figures are quite striking. The central estimate for how much a Harris presidency, based on her campaign proposals, would add to the debt, $3.5 trillion. For Donald Trump, it's $7.5 trillion. So for more on this, Maya McGinnis is joining us now here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Maya, there's a lot to unpack here. If we could just begin with the thesis around Donald Trump specifically, because while that central figure is $7.5 trillion, the high figure is over $15 trillion. What would get us there, and why isn't that your base case?
Absolutely. So to start, obviously, this is not great news for the overall fiscal picture. And the reason is because candidates are promising to do so many things that they think will win over voters. When it comes to former President Trump, obviously, he has an agenda that is very tax heavy. He is going to extend his tax cuts, and he's going to add numerous new tax cuts, including potentially bringing the corporate tax down significantly lower than it already was. He also has very significant spending commitments, and one of the big ones that would get you to that highest number is he's talking about higher levels of spending for defense, and this could mean a huge range of things. One of the challenges we have in this effort is to figure out what is the specific proposal of the candidate. They're not very specific on the stump. And what the overall effects would be. So we see huge differences in the effects of his policies on the economy and some of the responses in things like how much he'd spend on defense, and in particular, the big tariffs that he's talking about, which would raise a lot of revenue, but there are huge questions about what the overall effects, both in terms of retaliation and effects on the economy, would be of those tariff policies.
The cumulative deficits from 2026 to 2035, what we're talking about here, Maya, your research is driving the fiscal conversation today in Washington. You're in all of the tip sheets this morning. You're here on Balance of Power talking about this, and I can only imagine what your inbox looks like. You do right. If the next president does not lead in putting a fiscal reform plan in place, we'll hit the record debt level this country has ever seen. What does that fiscal reform look like if they're taking advice from Maya McGinnis?
Yeah, I mean, and I think the reason we're getting a lot of attention for this report is it is such an important moment of consequence for the fiscal picture, and we are on track to be borrowing, $20 trillion over the next decade before all those emergencies, which you just talked about, which seem to be coming more and more quickly. And yet, I think partially due to the huge polarization right now, we have candidates who really do compete on who can give away more things. So those are norms that are going to be difficult to change. Not being a politician, though, I get to talk about what we really should be doing. We're focusing right now from both the candidates overall on big tax cuts and big spending increases. Before we consider any of those, and there are lots of smart policies within there, but the first thing we have to do is get a plan so that our debt is not growing faster than the overall economy. We have to look at all the things that aren't on the table from these candidates. We have to look at how we're going to raise broad amounts of new revenue. It's not just going to be on millionaires and billionaires. It's not just going to be in corporations. Those things can be a part of it, but there's going to have to be significant new revenue just to keep the debt where it is as a share of GDP would take $9 trillion in savings. The candidates haven't proposed anywhere close to that amount. And that will have to be coupled with big spending reductions. The caps that they put in place as part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, those should be continued going forward. But we're going to have to look at the biggest drivers of the debt, which is where the candidates don't really want to talk, but the aging of the population, our growing healthcare costs. And right now, the fastest growing part of the budget is interest. The way you cut that one is by bringing your deficits down. But we do have to look at Social Security and Medicare, both of which are headed to be insolvent in a very short amount of time. And instead of kind of pandering to seniors and trying to scare them about fixing the programs, we need real fixes for them, probably looking at both revenues and spending reductions to make sure they will be solvent. But we have to talk about the fact that there are trade-offs in budgets. And if the candidates want to pursue the things they're looking at, that should only come after a debt deal. And then they should guarantee that every new policy will be fully paid for and put out the details of the pay-fors that are just as specific as the details of all the new things they want to promise to do.
That would be something.
Kind of the opposite of what
that's
they
what
want
we're
to do.
always asking about here on Bloomberg. How do you pay for it? You don't often get necessarily a straight answer. Maya, to your point on just to keep stasis, keep things steady, you do find in your low-cost estimate that the Harris plan would be roughly deficit neutral. Your lower-end estimate for the Trump plan would still increase the debt by $1.45 trillion. So maybe it's not enough just to try to keep the status quo, but to bring that down. What assumptions are you making about where interest rates will be when you do this analysis? Because as we talk about some of their plans also being inflationary, that could mean a higher for longer interest rate environment as well.
You know, it could. We've seen that can happen. We've seen that big amounts of borrowing push up and cause inflation, lead to inflation, and push up interest rates, and that could certainly happen under this scenario. We stick with the scenarios that are put out there by the Congressional Budget Office, and actually as often as possible, we rely on estimates from the CBO or other impartial evaluators of these plans, so that it doesn't get overly political, and we don't have to make huge assumptions in doing this. But it's rather conservative where we're assuming interest rates will be. And there is a real risk that the more we push into the borrowing, the more that will push up rates. And what we know is that with the high levels of debt we currently have, just a small increase in interest rates, like 1 percentage point above what we're assuming, can lead to about $300 billion or more a year in interest costs. So there's a huge range of changes that could have from the economic effects.
Maya, we've only got a minute left, but we tend to hear from those representing the Trump camp and Donald Trump surrogates and supporters say you're not factoring in the growth. We're going to drill, baby, drill, bring prices lower, and we're going to grow out of this as we saw revenues increase when the Trump tax cuts were first enacted. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, we will absolutely hear that, oh, you're ignoring the huge, massive dynamic gains in all of this. First, in many of our assumptions, we do assume behavioral changes and dynamic changes to GDP. We look at that. In order to evaluate a whole plan, you have to look at the positive and negative effects on growth. By the way, $7.5 trillion in new borrowing has tremendously negative effects on growth. So it's quite likely the dynamic effects of this plan would do more harm to the economy than growth. And if you look at what happened in the tax cuts last time, they actually came in pretty much as assumed, which was they created some growth, but not nearly enough to pay for themselves. They led to large revenue losses, and sort of the bump up we saw a couple years ago didn't come from tax cuts. They came from coming out of COVID and some timing changes and market performances. But it is just a truth, as sad as it is, tax cuts do not pay for themselves. Same spending increases, they don't pay for themselves.
Maya, it's great to see you. Thank you for sharing your new research with us. Maya McGinnis, back with us on Bloomberg Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, where she is president. You can find a lot more on this online and on the terminal. With Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
1:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We begin with an update on Hurricane Milton. It has strengthened into a catastrophic Category 5 hurricane as it bears down on Florida's west coast, where residents have begun to flee inland in a region that is still recovering from Helene's devastation. Stocks are low across the board, with the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all in the red right now. S&P down 22, a decline of 0.4%. The Dow down 222, lower by 0.5%. NASDAQ down 75, a drop right now of 0.4%. 10-year at 4.01%. The 2-year 3.97%. Spot gold at $26.45 the ounce. It is down 0.3%. Crude, though, a major story today, with West Texas Intermediate crude now at $77.09 a barrel, up 3.6%. A barrel of Brent, the global benchmark, trading above $80 a barrel. Brent right now $80.76. Barrel of Brent higher now by just about 3.5%. Apollo Global Management has agreed to buy Barnes Group in an all-cash transaction that values the tech and aerospace manufacturer at about $3.6 billion. Shares of Apollo, they're down 0.5%. Barnes Group up today by 2.7%. Recapping, stocks lower. S&P down 0.4%. The 10-year above 4%, 4.01 right now on the 10-year. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. And Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to Washington, and once again, your hosts, here they are, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet with the latest look at the trading day. Thank you so much. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew here in Washington, where we continue to bring you the latest from the campaign trail and also on the issues that could move the needle in swing states, including this latest headline out of Georgia. Remembering last week, a judge in Fulton County overturned the state's 6-week abortion ban, found it unconstitutionally prohibited abortions. Now Georgia's Supreme Court today has struck down that ruling, putting back into place that 6-week ban while it considers the appeal here. This, of course, putting a spotlight on the issue of reproductive rights in a state that ultimately could decide the Electoral College and ultimately the election. And it comes, Joe, just after Kamala Harris sat down for an interview on the popular podcast Call Her Daddy with Alex Cooper, a conversation centered very much around women's rights and reproductive rights. And of course, it's just one part of a media blitz Harris will have underway this week, as we'll also hear from her tonight in a sit down on 60 Minutes, which Donald Trump initially agreed to and then decided not to do.
Yeah, I'll be curious to hear what they tell us on CBS about how that all transpired. Apparently, there will be a bit of a background story on why it is only one of the two candidates. Tim Walz will also be involved. But yeah, you're right. This is quite the media blitz and somewhat different than what you might suspect. Not sitting down with journalists or news agencies. It's The View. She's headed to New York tonight. The View, Howard Stern, the Howard Stern Show, and then Stephen Colbert. All, I think we can argue, friendly audiences. We'll see how the panel feels about it. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are with us, our signature panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors. She is, of course, political science professor at Iona University. He is partner at Stone Court Capital. And Jeannie, I wonder your thoughts on the selections here. We're going to have a lot of eyeballs and ears on these interviews. They are mainstream programs. The View, of course, will have its own brand, and so will Howard Stern. What do you make of the selections, knowing specifically that Howard Stern has made a career on racist and sexist humor?
Yeah, I mean, it is quite a list. As I'm here listening talk about Howard Stern, and then Kaylee was talking about Call Her Daddy, which we know is a show primarily for young women and primarily about sex and dating and all those things. You know, I think back to, like, remember when Bill Clinton went on, like, Arsenio Hall or talked boxers versus briefs, and we were all in uproar. It's downright tame compared to where we are now and these selections. But, you know, to me, she's been getting a lot of heat for not doing interviews. So they are flooding the zone, so to speak. They have a variety of media outlets they're talking to, or she is talking to, as well as her running mate, Tim Walz. And, you know, they are trying to appeal to certain segments. For my mind, the most important is Howard Stern. She also did this podcast called All the Smoke, which is very appealing to young African-American men. These are constituencies she needs to reach. And then the Call Her Daddy is, of course, doubling down on her, enormous support with young women. So she is hitting all the bases here. I think she should add to these, go to the local media in these swing states. Local media still matters an awful lot on the campaign trail. So I think she should continue to do that. She's done some, but the more the better in my mind.
And we'll restate here that both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have a standing invitation to come sit down for an interview here on Bloomberg TV and radio. So, Rick, with that in mind, we would like to see them here. If you were running this campaign, where else would you send her? Frankly, both of the candidates, what audiences are they not actually reaching that they still need to as they try to get every last vote?
Well, if you talk about Howard Stern and you're talking about 10 million viewers a week, listeners, then you got to talk about Joe Rogan. I mean, like, what an interesting interview that would be if Kamala Harris and Donald Trump individually booked into that show. But look, I think that one of the things you mentioned earlier is that these are all very targeted. I mean, Howard Stern's demographic is, wealthier, 35 to 45-year-olds. These are profiles of swing voters, younger women, young black men. You're going to see a lot of focus on those people who have a message into those demographics. And I think the ultimate slam dunk is going to be, deploying Barack Obama later in the campaign here. Well, later in the campaign, we only got 28 days to go. Because one of the places that the Harris campaign needs shoring up is with those young black men who have had flirtations with Donald Trump's messaging. So I think that it's the best thing I did and the most fun I've ever had as a campaign manager was matching up news outlets with demographics and finding people who had great input, but maybe not nationally recognized. So much more fun than just booking your candidate on the nightly news or a Sunday talk show.
Yeah. Well, we saw Donald Trump interviewed by Elon Musk. Of course, Jeannie and Elon Musk showed up in Butler, Pennsylvania last weekend. We told you he'd be there. This is, of course, the site of the first attempted assassination against Donald Trump. And while we're talking about one campaign's leveraging of pop culture and celebrity, we should talk about this. Elon Musk was brought up on the stage inside the glass box that Donald Trump speaks in, the bulletproof box. Here's what he said.
President Trump must win to preserve the Constitution. He must win to preserve democracy in America. This is a must-win situation. Must win. So I have one ask for everyone in the audience, everyone who watches this video, everyone on the live stream. There's one request. It's very important. Register to vote.
I don't know if that will be as powerful as Taylor Swift's attempts to register voters at vote.org, Jeannie, but I want to ask you about the double standard and the rhetoric here, because I spent all Sunday morning watching news programs in which we heard from the likes of Speaker Mike Johnson and other Republicans who said that Democrats were responsible for Donald Trump and the attempted assassinations because they have framed him, as we hear from Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and others, as the end of democracy. But we just heard as well from Elon Musk, as we do from Donald Trump, that Trump must win to preserve democracy in America. Elon Musk went further to say that if Trump loses, there won't be another election. So is this coming from both sides or not?
It is coming from both sides. Both sides are using this provocative language. We heard it also, just to add to your litany, from Lara Trump on CNN, saying that it was a choice between good and evil. We heard from Eric Trump talking about the fact that Democrats are trying to kill his father. So the rhetoric is on both sides. And, we've talked about this a little bit before, but it's important to underscore what happens when both sides use this kind of provocative rhetoric is sort of a dilution where voters throw up their hands and say, I'm just going to discount all of it. It's sort of like when they play those medicine commercials and they give you the litany of bad things that can happen to you if you take this aspirin. Well, you start to say can't be all that bad because everything from the smallest to the biggest issues can happen. And so that's a known theory. It has an impact on people, and they sort of start to discount. And can I just say my favorite part of Elon Musk's appearance was not just the dark MAGA, but his jumping, which reminded me of Tom Cruise on Oprah Winfrey's couch. What is happening?
2 feet off
Why
the
is
ground.
he? That's right.
Oh, the jumping memes have been plentiful in the last 48 hours. That is all I will say about that. There also is, to Joe's point, Rick, this question about how much having someone like Elon Musk in your corner actually matters. Bloomberg and Morning Consult, actually, in our latest swing state poll, found that Elon Musk across the 7 battleground states has a 40% favorable rating, 34 unfavorable. Taylor Swift, who of course came out and endorsed Harris after the debate with Donald Trump, 47% favorable, 36% unfavorable. So I'm not sure, as we consider the favorability here, how much that might make a difference, Rick. But it also is a question of the platform. Surely both can reach a large audience. We all know about Taylor Swift's Instagram following, but Elon Musk literally owns X, one of the social media platforms in which information, true or false, about this election is being propagated. Is that the most powerful weapon of all?
It may be one of the most powerful. It depends upon what motivation you have and whether or not those motivations are generating positives or negatives for the candidate you choose to endorse. The Taylor Swift thing is pretty benign, right? First of all, they're both popular, which is better than most politicians can say. Second, does Taylor Swift's support actually make a voter look twice at the candidate she's endorsing? And I would say that's probably true. Based on the polling I've seen, she can drive eyeballs. And of course, there's a net negative effect. When she endorsed Kamala Harris after the debate, we saw Republicans saying she's much more unfavorable than they had in larger numbers before the endorsement. And I have no doubt that this will have the same effect on someone like Elon Musk. But when you control a huge media outlet that's out there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, like X, I would say your leverage to influence the dialogue in the campaign and therefore potentially the outcome is significantly higher. And unless Taylor Swift decides to hit the road and start campaigning every day, Elon Musk is going to have a little more influence than she's going to have on the outcome of this election.
The New York Times is out with quite a piece today on Donald Trump's speaking style and cognitive ability, pointing to a computer analysis that finds Trump's rally speeches now last an average of 82 minutes, up from 45 in 2016. He uses 13% more all or nothing terms like always or never, 32% more negative words than positive, and making references to the 80s and 90s, Hannibal Lecter, Johnny Carson, Cary Grant, and so on. I guess it goes further back. Jeannie, in our remaining 30 seconds, will Democrats make a bigger issue of age in these last 4 weeks?
Yeah, I think they should. And speaking of the New York Times, they have been running a lot of pieces, as you mentioned, talking about age, because, of course, it fell by the wayside after Joe Biden withdrew and Donald Trump is an elderly man. And let's just say another difference between Taylor Swift and Elon Musk of many. Taylor Swift doesn't get billions of dollars in government contracts. Just saying.
There is.
Yeah, last I checked, no rocket company yet owned by Taylor Swift. Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, our signature political panel, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll have more straight ahead on this Monday edition of Balance of Power right here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Do want to begin with an update on Hurricane Milton. Those winds are picking up. Hurricane Milton did strengthen into a catastrophic Category 5 hurricane as it bears down on Florida's west coast. The latest update now from the National Hurricane Center, it puts the winds at 175 miles an hour. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all trading lower. S&P 500 index down 27 now, a decline of 0.5%. Traders are trimming bets on Fed rate cuts, sending Treasury 10-year yields above 4%, 10-year 4.01%, the 2-year 3.97%. Equities lower across the board. The Dow now down 0.6%, lower by 269 points. We have got NASDAQ down 85, a decline of 0.5%, while the Russell 2000 index now lower by 0.8%. Spot gold falling $5 the ounce, down 0.2%, while West Texas Intermediate crude up 3.6%, 77.06 a barrel, and West Texas Brent crude, the global benchmark, 80.81 right now, up 3.5%. And to be clear, we got WTI 77.07. It is up by 3.6%. Rio Tinto Group is making an approach for Arcadium Lithium, confirming the latest takeover proposal in a sector turning its attention back to growth as major miners scramble to increase their exposure to energy transition metals. Rio Tinto, the ADR is up by about 0.2%. Arcadium now surging by 32%. Recapping, S&P down 0.5% with a 10-year that's yielding 4.01%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Limes.
Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Remarkable headlines on Hurricane Milton. Kaylee, 175-mile-an-hour winds. This is quite remarkable as we follow the track of this storm, reaching Category 5 since we've taken air at 12 noon Eastern Time and on its way to the Gulf Coast of Florida. This is something following Helene that could bring another disruption to the campaign. And you wonder if we're going to be in a situation later this week if the candidates are not only reacting to this, but they're taking ads down, because this is a big one.
Yeah, it could be a massive human tragedy, of course, as we've already seen hundreds of deaths as a result of Helene. And this could be a very powerful storm that could ultimately result in the loss of human life, not to mention it could be tens of billions of dollars in economic damages, as well as we continue to follow that tragedy. Of course, we also mark 1 year since another today. Joe, it is October 7th. It has now been 1 full year since the Hamas attack on Israel, which of course killed more than 1,000 people and resulted in hundreds more being taken hostage. Many of those hostages have also died over the course of the last 12 months.
And so imagine what it was like this morning for Israelis to wake up in communities along the Gaza Strip to air raid sirens, as they did on this day 1 year ago. In fact, there was shelling from Gaza, from Hamas. Most all of the projectiles were brought down by Israel, but the idea that we're marking this solemn date does not indicate that the fighting is stopping today, Kaylee.
No, in fact, all signs point to this fight continuing for some time. So we want to turn now to Evelyn Farkas of the McCain Institute, where she is executive director. She's also former deputy assistant secretary of defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio, Evelyn. I know you yourself this past summer visited some of the scenes of the death of October 7th, including where the Nova Music Festival was being held, where 400 more than that were killed, 40 taken hostage, including a kibbutz as well, where 64 civilians were killed, 19 were taken hostage into Gaza. Can you just give us first your personal reflections on the events of that day and the year that has followed?
Yeah, I mean, Kaylee, obviously there's no way to take in the tremendous loss of life and also just the brutality. You know, the Nova Music Festival, it's out there. It's a very kind of dry, but then there are trees, and it's as open, almost like a field of trees, of small trees. And you can imagine these young people just having a party, enjoying themselves, and then to see just, you know, sign after sign with a remembrance of all of these young people, like a field of people mowed down by the brutal Hamas terrorists. So that was really dramatic. And, you know, walking through there, it was just sort of like a holy sight almost. Going to the kibbutz, I went to Kfar Aza. That was different because we had a guide in that case, and it was a woman who was a survivor. She wasn't there on the day of the actual attack, but her family was, and she told all kinds of stories. And I think the biggest takeaway that she had was that she no longer believed that she could sit and peacefully have tea in the big field between her kibbutz and Gaza, where the Palestinians lived, many of whom she had known, and have tea and live together in harmony. But she said very clearly that I need them to have security and prosperity in order for us Israeli Jews to have security as well. So it was a very somber visit. And of course, this anniversary just dredges up all of the anxiety, which has not been put to rest over the past year. I think that much is clear.
Evelyn, we've frequently heard the events of October 7th, the attack on October 7th, compared to 9/11, that this was Israel's 9/11, and some see it, in fact, impacting by many magnitudes larger when you consider the population and the percentage of people whose lives were taken on this day. How many more 9/11s will it take to end this?
Well, the 9/11 comparison is actually pretty good, Joe, because first of all, while there were warnings, the government didn't take proper action in advance. So there were intelligence failures, just as we had intelligence failures here in the US in the run-up to 9/11. The second comparison that's apt is that it took first responders a while to get to the scene, but then they actually couldn't save very many people. So the killing was very quick. And in that respect, it's similar. And then, of course, the shock to the entire society, the fact that Israel, a country that has the strongest military in the Middle East, the nuclear power in the Middle East, the country that we have always, the United States, provided military assistance to in order to make sure that they have what we call a qualitative edge militarily, that somehow they could be vulnerable to such an attack, such an existential attack. I think that is just like 9/11. How do we avoid it? I think we need to make sure that for once and for all, there is a solution to the Palestinians' right to self-determination. And as the woman that I spoke to in Kfar Aza, the kibbutz, said, and actually Palestinians that also I met with in Ramallah, they also spoke about the need for security for both sides. I think we need to find a way back to a two-state solution. It will be very hard because right now the current Israeli government has been talking about a one-state solution. And the far-right members of Netanyahu's government, they're not interested in a two-state solution. But the only way to have lasting peace is for the Palestinians also to see their rights respected.
Well, and that lasting peace may feel far away to many as we are seeing, instead of a cooling in the conflict, an escalation in it. As Joe and I were mentioning, not only were rockets fired at Israel, but Israel is continuing to conduct its strike operations in southern Lebanon. As we consider, and you just mentioned the intelligence failures that led to the events, or at least were a contributing factor to what happened on October 7th, when we consider the safety of Israel, which clearly was not safe on that day, is Israel safer now that it has, to at least a certain extent, been able to attack the capabilities of those that would threaten it, including Hamas and Hezbollah, or because of their actions, has it actually created more danger in the region, including from Iran, that sent missiles Israel's way last week?
Yeah, I would say, Kelly, if you're looking at the threat picture at the moment, Israel has bought itself some time. So the Iranian proxies, Hamas in Gaza, and Hezbollah in the coming from the north, so coming from Lebanon, they have been beaten down badly. Even the Israeli defense minister said in September that Hamas was no longer a real, capable military threat to the state of Israel. I don't know what his latest assessment is. Clearly, Hezbollah has been incredibly weakened. But let's not forget that the real threat is coming from Iran. Iran is using these two groups plus the Houthis in Yemen to attack Israel so that it doesn't get into a direct war with Israel. That appears to perhaps have changed, and that would put Israel in a more dangerous situation if indeed it did get into direct war with Iran potentially.
Well, some think this is an opportunity to strike Iran, to change the order and the balance of power in the Middle East. Evelyn, what should Israel do as it calculates its next move?
Well, Joe, I think that Israel, together with the United States, we are their treaty ally. We should be talking about how do we bring about regime change without invading Iran, and putting pressure on Iran, using military force, using diplomatic pressure, using all of our other allies in the Middle East is an important part of this. And we haven't seen a strategy articulated by the Israeli government. There is a bit of an opportunity here when it comes to the nuclear program, because the biggest threat to Israel is that Iran gets a nuclear weapons program, which means that Iran can neuter Israel's advantage in the nuclear arena if they did come to blows, direct war. And so we don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapons program for that reason. Also because we don't want more countries in the Middle East deciding, and around the world, frankly, deciding that they also want their nuclear programs. That makes the world a lot more dangerous. So there may be calculations going on. I think they should be behind the scenes and not worked out through the media that pertain to the nuclear facilities in particular.
Well, as you describe something that could make the world more dangerous, I think it's fair to say, Evelyn, that the world feels pretty dangerous already, and it could be a very dangerous world that the next president of the United States inherits. How do you, if we operate under the assumption that this conflict will not be resolved when the next president is inaugurated, how could the nature of it change depending on who it is in the White House and what kind of administration we'll be looking at?
Kayleigh, if it's Kamala Harris, I believe that she would be more engaged in trying to solve the conflict. First of all, there's the personal element. Her husband is Jewish. Second of all, there's the reality that for the United States, we need to protect Israel's right to exist, and it's really in jeopardy right now. So that's a U.S. national security interest. We also want to protect as much as we can stability in the Middle East, and as I said, address the nuclear and terrorist threat posed by Iran. So I believe that she'll get more engaged. Right now, the Biden administration, frankly, is probably somewhat hamstrung by the fact that we have upcoming elections, and anything they do, if it doesn't turn out in the short run, if it causes friction or controversy in the short run, it could be bad for Kamala Harris. But I do think that if the vice president were to win, she would be more engaged. With regard to Donald Trump, we know that he's generally given a carte blanche. He's been in office before as president, so he's given a carte blanche to the far right and to Netanyahu in Israel before. That doesn't, frankly, make me optimistic, because he would be more willing then to go along with what they call the one-state solution, which means essentially just putting the Palestinians in these kinds of settlements in Gaza and the West Bank, which, as we've seen, is just a powder keg and a recipe for more conflict. So I think that the hands-off approach of Donald Trump would be the much more dangerous one for the U.S. and for Israel.
As we consider the preparations underway here for a response to Iran, Evelyn, the U.S. has sent ships, it has sent missiles, fighter jets, and thousands of troops to the region. What else is needed?
I think aggressive diplomacy. We had an opportunity back in the fall when the Israeli defense minister was saying that Hamas is severely degraded and it's no longer an organized military threat to the state of Israel, to negotiate a release of the hostages who, this is the anniversary of them being held in captivity. That was an opportunity that was lost, but it's not permanently lost. And so I think that's what we need to focus on right now, trying to get those hostages out. Whatever short-term deal you have to make with Hamas, I think, again, as long as it's a prisoner exchange and within the normal bounds of this kind of negotiation, should be worth it to the Israeli government, certainly to the Israeli people, and to the U.S. government.
Evelyn, it's great to have you back. Evelyn Farkas is Executive Director of the McCain Institute at Arizona State University. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. We'll have a lot more on this story and the other stories we're covering from the world of politics in the late edition of Balance of Power. That starts at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And Kaylee, I don't know if you saw this. Tomorrow morning, we've got something big coming up on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Indeed, we do. JP Morgan CEO and Chair Jamie Dimon will be sitting down with our very own Lisa Abramowitz for an exclusive interview in London at JP Morgan's 12th edition of the Techstars Conference in emerging markets, Europe, Middle East, and Africa, MEA.
That's right.
But this is going to be a big conversation. I bet he'll weigh in on the election to a certain degree. Remember when we thought he might run for president?
That's correct. 9:30, by the way, a.m. Eastern Time at the opening bell. Jamie Dimon live here on Bloomberg. We'll catch you in a couple of hours right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody, live on TV, radio, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. This is Bloomberg Business Week for this Monday, October 7th. I'm Carol Master along with Tim Stanovic. Let's get to the setup because, Tim, as we just teased, it does feel like a pretty heavy Monday.
Yeah, U.S. yields are back at 4% for the first time going back to August. We also have another hurricane menacing Florida. And, Carol, everything happening geopolitically, specifically in the Middle East.
Yeah, we've got a milestone on this Monday, October 7th. And this is all, as you said, on our radar. So as we said, today is the one-year anniversary since the Hamas attack on Israel. Why the way out must start with Israel. We'll get into that. It's the subject of a Bloomberg column.
Plus, Pfizer shares getting quite a shot in the arm. I like what you did there, Carol.
Thank you. Yeah, worked hard on
Even
that
though I said it, you wrote it.
It's a team effort, folks. As we mentioned, as Tim mentioned, talk about team effort. U.S. Treasury yields above 4% again. We've got an inverted yield curve. We did see that play out. So we're going to talk about inflation, shock inflation, maybe the toolkit that we have just ain't enough. We'll get into that in just a moment.
Also setting up to be quite the recipe for those derivatives enhanced ETFs. They are all the rage with retail investors. Some stocks moving 3x, Carol.
Yeah.
Single stocks. It's pretty incredible.
That's why it's a Bloomberg Big Take and a most read story on the Bloomberg today. Hey, and time to buy those Gigundo skeletons, you know?
You have yours yet?
No. If my daughter was younger, we'd probably have one. We're going to talk about Halloween shopping, holiday shopping.
That thing?
I don't know. You fold up the bones. What can I tell you? Put it in the basement.
Fold up the bones.
Ooh,
throw the bones
like
in the basement.
movie.
Very Halloween, right?
Yeah. All right, everybody. All of this to come over the next 60 minutes. First up, let's get a check on the trading day. Here is Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much indeed. On this Back to Work Monday, we have got stocks trading very close to session lows, right to the numbers here. 28-point drop right now for the S&P 500 index. The S&P is down at 57.22, a decline now of 0.5%. Dow Jones Industrial Average also in the red. We have got the Dow down 319, a decline of 0.8%, while NASDAQ now lower by 81, a drop there of just about 0.5%. 10-year 4.01% with a 2-year 3.98%. Gold down $5 the ounce, down 0.2%. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 3.4%, 76.91 a barrel. Brent trading back above $80 a barrel, 80.68. Brent, of course, the global benchmark, up by 3.4%. Oil is rallying as the market waits to see if Israel will retaliate against Tehran for last week's missile attack by targeting the country's oil infrastructure. Among oil stocks today, we've got ExxonMobil up by 0.6%. ADR's of BP trading higher by 0.8%. And Chevron right now, Chevron climbing by 0.4%. XLE, the Energy Select Sector Spider ETF, up by 0.5%. Recapping, S&P down 30, down 0.5%. The 10-year 4.01%. West Texas Intermediate crude 76.91 a barrel, up now by 3.4%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, so appreciate that update on the trade on this Monday. Speaking of the trade, as we've been talking about all day long here at Bloomberg, key U.S. Treasury yields back at 4%. Last seen in August, a blowout jobs report on Friday, undercutting the chances for another big interest rate reduction from the Fed. Then you have open interest data that tracks positioning in the futures market that fell sharply across multiple contracts, linked to the secured overnight financing rate, or SOFR, signaling capitulation of long positions. I've got to just say, everybody's scaling back their expectations, Tim, when it comes to Fed rate cuts this year.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Wall Street economists continue to pile on, abandoning forecasts for a half-point cut in November. Rates and inflation, Carol, still top of mind, especially with this week's upcoming CPI print. On that, in the new issue of Bloomberg Markets, Bloomberg's head of economics and government, Stephanie Flanders, writes a column all about policymaking takeaways from the recent inflation shocks and how our standard toolkit needs an overhaul.
So let's get to it, and to tell us more about this opinion, I guess it's a column, I shouldn't say opinion, is the editor of Bloomberg Markets Magazine, Pat Regnier, here in studio. Is it, I can write, it's a column.
Sure.
Taking a look at it. Hey, Pat, I do feel like, we feel like we talk about it so much that the candidates on the campaign trail, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, talk a lot about inflation, how to deal with it. It's a big thing that comes up. American voters care about it a lot. Tell us, though, specifically what Stephanie's mission was and what you guys wanted to do in this column.
So this was for our special economics issue, and as we were looking through our whole issue, we always try to find, like, what's the theme that runs through every story. And honestly, the deep theme of every story was a world in shock, or preparing for certain kinds of shock. So we all know about the pandemic shock. we're also thinking about the shocks that come from climate change. One of the candidates in this election is talking about large-scale tariffs, which would be a kind of shock.
Right.
And all of them ultimately kind of reverberate through prices. And one of the things I think Stephanie was wrestling with is, inflation now looks like it's under control, and yet the political after effects of the inflation that we have had are still very much with us. And then there's reason to think that there might be more shocks that could create more of these kind of price moments. I think if you talk to some economists, they would say that's not necessarily inflation.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the traditional demand side driven inflation.
And yet we feel it.
And yet we have it,
Right.
and politicians have to deal with it. And it may be even that, this is something that Tom Orlick talks about too, that central bankers and monetary authorities don't have all of the tools to deal with those kinds of shocks.
So let's talk about that, the tension between what an elected official can do and what a central bank can do when it comes to prices. Look, it depends on the country and the head of state, certainly.
Right.
Very big differences as you look throughout the world.
Important points.
Yeah.
But top of mind here in the U.S. and top of mind for politicians in Europe and South America, too.
Sure. So, I mean, the basic tool that monetary policy has is changing interest rates. And that has this kind of broad effect that covers over the whole economy, even if you're mostly getting the inflation from one place or from one source. Politicians have different tools. They can, spend money, turn it on, turn it off. I think we've often found that they don't necessarily do that in the kind of, to use a bit of jargon, counter-cyclical ways that you'd like to do it. So sometimes their timing's not great because they're under different kinds of political pressures. And also, there's a sense that you want them to be careful about intervening with markets because they can create price distortions. And so that's one of the things that Stephanie was kind of wrestling with, was how do we create some room for politicians to do the things that central banks can't without making new kinds of mischief?
Well, and I think that's such an important point, that if there's a shock in one part of the market, how do you prevent it from spreading, which is one of the things that she says, like, we kind of need to think about, correct?
That's right. So, one of the points she makes is when politicians are thinking about intervening with markets, can they do it in a way that still preserves a price signal? So the classic example of this is in Europe, a lot of the price shock, and there it's often not talked about as inflation, but as a cost of living crisis, is just literally the cost of like heating your home, buying gas for your car, energy shocks, energy and electricity. So European governments have had to ask themselves, how do we sort of soften the blow to households for this without making it worse? If you soften the blow too much, they don't have a price signal.
Yeah.
And then you get even more inflation in that price. Stephanie talks about something that they did in Germany called a gas price break, which sort of partially buffers the core cost of energy for households, but then above a certain point exposes people to that price shock so that they have some incentive to conserve.
Pat, given the idea of what could lead to pockets of inflation around the world in the coming years, how is it different, and given what we learned from 2020, 2021 on to right now, how is that different than historically how inflation has peaked its head around the world?
Well, that's probably a very big debate, but I think like the classic way that we talk about inflation, particularly since the 1970s, is as, well, this is an economy that got overheated. So that's when people use the jargon, this is demand-driven inflation. It's people got too used to making too much money for too long, and they started to be willing to pay more for things. And so now you have this pressure that's coming up from everybody just having more money in their pocket. This kind of shock inflation, and this is a debate. Some people will say that the inflation of the 70s started with a shock, right? But that it comes from just like one pressure point in the economy gets out of whack. And then that creates a need for everybody to make more money. Now, these two things interplay, as I just kind of pointed out. Eventually that pressure point can then create new expectations. And
look, it's something we've talked about a lot, Carol, in recent years, given how fragile the supply chain is, how we learned that in the wake of the pandemic in 2020, and how if one thing breaks or if one canal doesn't work, it has repercussions around the world.
Right, we saw it so extreme, and I think a lot about the supply-demand equation, right? Because there's different things that can cause inflation, right? Like as you said, it could be a supply shock, or it can be something that kind of triggers demand. Having said that, coming away from this column, I mean, she's basically saying we need more things to deal with in terms of these supply shocks.
And I think you would say that one of the reasons you need it is that politicians will not not try to deal with it,
Right.
I mean, we have a situation right now where the economists will tell you that inflation is a handled problem. We're having an election about inflation.
Right,
Right?
exactly.
The incentives are to find ways to address these questions.
Companies' role, very briefly.
So one of the things that Stephanie deals with is this question of maybe sometimes companies are just using inflationary moments to mark up prices, and policymakers probably need to be aware of that and ask themselves where it comes from, which may be too much market concentration.
Yeah, exactly, right. So there's so many factors to think about. Just really topical in terms of the environment we're in, because I feel like every conversation somehow we bring up inflation in some form or the other. Pat, thank you.
Thank you.
So glad you could join us. Pat Regnier, editor of Bloomberg Markets Magazine. Check out the issue. As you said, it's the economy issue. So some really great things certainly heading into the election. All right, so that is kind of our macro look on this Monday. Now we want to get to the micro, and in particular, one name in the equity world that we are focusing on big time.
Yeah, Pfizer shares rallying right now, higher by 2.5% on a day when the rest of the market is lower. It's up the most in more than 5 months. The stock, we should note, though, just a little changed this year. According to a person familiar with the matter, activist investor Starboard Value has taken a stake of about $1 billion in Pfizer, and it's seeking to spur a turnaround of the pharma giant. This is according to a person, Carol, familiar with the matter.
All right, so let's get to it. Let's get more because it does seem like COVID has certainly affected this company, and they're trying to figure out what's next for them. Bloomberg News health reporter Madison Muller back in our studio. Good to have you here. Pfizer, like one of the darlings, right? During COVID, did they really think that the COVID vaccine was going to be there, like keep them going and going for years to come? Like, is that what this is about?
I do think that a lot of people thought during the pandemic that there was going to be a longer tail to COVID, and Pfizer has certainly said that, like that the demand has declined a lot more rapidly for the vaccine and their treatment than they anticipated. But that being said, I mean, in the pharma world, CEOs are always looking to what's next. Like, that is not something that's new. That's the minute you have a blockbuster, we talk about Lilly all the time on the show. Like, they are already thinking about and looking at what's next. They are so not settled on obesity. They want to be prepared for the future. So that's something that all pharma CEOs should be and are talking about frequently. So to say that they didn't know that this was going to happen is kind of, naive.
But we should go back and understand how big of a boost to
Right.
Pfizer's top and bottom lines the COVID vaccine was.
Right.
In your piece, you said that the vaccine and treatment more than doubled revenue to $100 billion in 2022 from $42 billion back in 2020.
That's
Massive.
a boost. That's a boost. Huge boost. Right. Huge boost. And, it's not like they haven't been trying to prepare for what's next. The CEO, Albert Bourla, has done a number of deals in recent years. They're trying to replenish their pipeline. But this is the problem, is that investors are not happy with the deals that they've done. So far, it has not replenished those revenues quickly enough. And they did this enormous Seagen deal last year, $43 billion. And that has given them a stable of good cancer drugs, potential blockbusters. However, again, it's not happening quickly enough. They're not reaping the rewards of that quickly enough and as fast as investors had hoped.
What do you think? I had a brother who worked in the pharmaceutical industry for a long time, and we always talked about this. He's like, listen, R&D, we spend a lot. This is why they charge a lot, because they put a lot of drugs out, and maybe one will be a blockbuster, but a lot of times they're not. You understand this world. So again, is it just this is the business and they're in a lull, or is there something a little bit more complicated going on at Pfizer?
Yeah, I think that that's one of the things that we're thinking Starboard's sort of like getting involved to figure out. Are these bad deals? Is it just bad luck? Like you said, bad luck in pharma is a huge part of it. We've talked about that again with Lilly. Like, they kind of ignored obesity for a number of years, thinking it wasn't going to be a big thing, and then it came back into style, so to speak, within pharma, and that just is kind of what happens. There's like these ebbs and flows of people not being interested in neuro, and then they are interested in neuro again, and then because there's like one breakthrough and one company that does really well and has a really successful drug, and then everyone else sort of rushes into it. So I guess it remains to be seen what's going to happen with Pfizer, and we're still trying to get more details about, what this what Starboard is looking at.
But they've got a former Pfizer CEO helping them, right?
Yes,
Which
yeah.
is kind of interesting to me, right?
Former Pfizer CEO and a
Talk
former
about knowing the
CFO.
inside, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of that, and how are you guys thinking about that?
I mean, these people know the business, obviously,
Yeah.
and to have, I mean, it's interesting. We were looking at some of the other healthcare, the things that Starboard has gotten involved in healthcare. So they got involved with Bristol Myers, they got involved with Magellan, Humana, and we were kind of like looking at their track record a little bit, and it could help having the former CEO, CFO of the company sort of on board, but we just don't know what capacity they would be serving in or involved in going forward.
I don't remember the last time you were on our program not talking about GLP-1s. And we're not
It's like wait, are we in an alternate universe?
We're not,
right,
but we're not in an alternate universe because that's
No.
part of the Pfizer story.
It is, yeah,
It's a
it
big
is.
part of the Pfizer story. When we talk about GLP-1s, we talk about products from companies like Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly. What's the status of what Pfizer has been trying to develop when it comes to GLP-1s?
So Pfizer has been trying to develop a pill, and like we've talked about, that is likely to be the next big thing in obesity. But their efforts have not gone so well so far. They had one pill that they just had to discontinue entirely, another one twice daily pill. The rates of side effects were really high in trials, so they discontinued those trials, and now they're going forward with a once daily formulation. But the analysts that I've spoken to are like, we don't know if this is going to be a competitive product. I mean, they still need to see more data, but so far what they've seen is like, there are so many other companies, like we know, that are developing pills for obesity now.
Yeah.
And how does Pfizer stack up to those? I don't really know. But, Albert Bourla at one point was really talking up what the company was doing in obesity, and that was maybe one of the next prospects for it. And so far, that hasn't gone according to plan.
So, I don't know. Do we know Starboard's end game here, or we don't? We're just kind of
that's
watching.
what we're still trying to figure out. If anyone knows, you're free to email me.
Because I
Call
am
me.
curious, what's a turnaround look? I mean, do they have stuff to sell, or you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Is
right.
it just? I mean, they've sold off stuff.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, I mean, they have this huge cancer business now. And then they have all these other products, like they have vaccine, migraine drug. So that is one of the things also that we've heard, is that their like M&A strategy hasn't been super focused. It's like just kind of all over the place.
Yeah.
And their big focus now is on cancer, but leading up to that Seagen purchase was just like a couple of other deals that sort of unclear.
Put the COVID shot just at the end of the interview back into perspective for us. Should investors think about this as like a footnote or any other sort of
I thought you were going to ask her, should I get a
vaccine?
COVID shot?
No, I won't bore
Sorry.
everybody with my questions about that.
Yeah.
but-
The debate.
I mean, it
was
is the
on.
debate does
season.
go
Flu
on.
shots,
Yeah.
everyone's getting them now.
But how should investors think about that very briefly?
I mean, that's a good question. I think, I guess it's unclear. Like every season, the demand sort of, I mean, we thought maybe there would be more demand as we moved back to seasonal in the fall. People don't have that maybe animosity towards the COVID shots after having to get so many in a row. But the demand is not there. People are very wary, and I don't know.
I think
sick of getting all
celebrity
kinds of
endorsements.
shots.
Or it's
yeah.
like if you get COVID, then I'm like, I'm going to go get COVID.
Yeah.
It takes 3 weeks for the shot to kick in.
I know.
Well, then you have immunity if you get exposed. So.
Madison Muller, thank you so much. This is Bloomberg.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Do want to begin with an update on Hurricane Milton. It exploded into the Atlantic's strongest hurricane this year, bearing down as a catastrophic Category 5 storm on a Florida region that is still struggling to recover from Helene's devastation. Last update from the National Hurricane Service: Milton's top winds have now reached 175 miles an hour. It is a down day for the Dow. The S&P and NASDAQ stocks are tumbling as traders trim bets on a Fed rate cut, sending 10-year Treasury yields above 4%. Right now we have got the 10-year at 4.01% with the 2-year, 3.98%. Equities lower across the board. S&P down 34 now, down 0.6%. We've got the Dow down 358, down 0.9%. NASDAQ down 99, drop there of 0.5%. That 10-year does bear repeating, 4.01% right now. Gold down $7 the ounce, down by about 0.3%. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 3.2%, 76.78 for a barrel of WTI. As we have been reporting, sources tell Bloomberg the activist investor Starboard Value has taken a stake of about $1 billion in Pfizer and is seeking to spur a turnaround of the struggling pharmaceuticals giant. On a down day for the rest of the market, Pfizer shares up now by just about 2.4%. Again, recapping, stocks lower, S&P down 0.6%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. You are listening and watching Bloomberg Business Week on this Monday, October 7th. It's almost hard to believe that today marks 1 year since Hamas fighters attacked Israel, killing 1,200 people and abducting 250. About 100 hostages remain in Gaza, though the Israeli military believes about a third of those are dead. And Tim, we know the fighting continues.
Almost 42,000 people have been killed by Israel's operations in Gaza. This according to the Hamas-run health ministry there. It doesn't distinguish between civilian and combatant casualties. The territory has been devastated by the conflict, much of the population of more than 2 million people displaced. And Carol, more than 1,500 people have been killed in Lebanon by Israel's bombings in recent weeks, and around 1 million have been displaced. That's according to local officials.
Bloomberg Opinion international affairs columnist Mark Champion writes that the way forward must start with Israel. He joins us from London to explain. Mark, we know it's later there, so thank you for sticking around. It is 1 year in. It is clear, or is it clear, maybe is the right question to ask, what Israel's mission and goal is and how to get there? And is it about creating a new regional order, really?
Well, that's exactly it. So the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been under, pressure to produce a strategy to say what he wants the region, an end game to be for Gaza. Now the war is spreading further to Lebanon. And he did come out with a vision of what it should be when he was speaking to the UN recently. And there he said, it is this better Middle East in which Israel is integrated into the economy. It becomes a catalyst for economic development. There's no more axis of resistance, which is, at the behest of Iran, trying to destroy Israel. And that's, a great vision. The point that I'm trying to make in the piece is that you can't achieve that by force alone. Israel does have to use force. After October the 7th, there was no possible choice but to. The question is, how do you fit that into a strategy that will get you to a place where Israel has security, its neighbors have security, there's stability? How do you get there? Part of it's going to be force. You have to deal with Hezbollah. You have to deal with Hamas. You have to deal with Iran. But you need another strategy, which is more political, in order to create a level of hope for the Palestinians, for people in Lebanon, for people in Iran, for that matter. None of which, in each case, many of the people in many cases, some of the majorities of the people have no interest in the agendas that these terrorist organizations such as Hamas and Hezbollah have, but they're not being offered any kind of perspective that would create hope for them.
It raises a question, Mark. In your view, did Israel miss an opportunity in the days following the attacks a year ago to take the weight of the world behind them, to try to respond in a way that wouldn't alienate even more?
I would argue that they did, and indeed, at the time, Netanyahu, his initial statements were actually very measured, and he said that we have to not lead, we have to stay level-headed, we have to remain proportionate, and I believe that if he'd been able to stick to that, then we would be in a better position. Israel would be in a better position, and certainly the Palestinians would. I mean, was a very difficult task, but I think the key was that Israel, once the attack had been made, everything that happened, the schedule and the timing and the pace at which it would happen, that was all in Israel's hands, because Hamas was not going anywhere. They are locked in. And it was up to Israel to determine when to start bombing from the air, when to move in the troops, how to move in the troops. It was an enormously difficult operation, but I do believe that it could have been done in ways that would have maintained more support internationally.
Mark, over the past year, much has been said about Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu not wanting to end the war in order to hold on to power. You single out, though, two of his ministers and their influence on what is happening. Who are they and what are they doing, and why is it so important to know what they are up to?
Right. Well, he has, in his cabinet, which is a coalition cabinet, he only managed to return to power with a very narrow majority, which is assembled through a coalition. So two of the parties in the coalition are ultra-right. One is religious and the other is nationalist. The people who lead those parties in the cabinet, they were given very sensitive jobs. So on the one hand, you have Ben Gvir, who is the Minister for National Security. So he is in charge of, domestic security, security in the West Bank, the police, etc. And then you have Smotrich, who is the finance minister. So he's in charge of the purse strings, including for the West Bank. And they have been setting the pace. They have said whenever there was a suggestion that there might be a ceasefire struck in Gaza, for example, they've made it very clear that if a deal was made, they would collapse the government, which they had the power to do. So they've been had an outsized influence, and whether Netanyahu personally agrees with them, and that he would have done this anyway or not, that's very difficult to say. But it's clear that this particular government, the most right wing in Israel's history, it happened to be there at a moment when it was really quite, it determined the way in which Israel would fight this war.
Mm-hmm.
When or how does it end? What does that look like? It's a question that I try to ask whenever we talk about this, because I think for so many people around the world, and especially people in the region, from the outside or from the inside, I think to many it looks like there's no end in sight.
I think it's very difficult to say. At the moment, the war is expanding into Lebanon. Exactly, it may be that the IDF generals and Netanyahu and his security apparatus, they don't know exactly how far they're going to go in Lebanon. It's very likely, it's kind of the way that these things tend to unfold, that they will feel their way depending on what happens. Nobody could have really predicted the extraordinary success that their intelligence services have had in decapitating Hezbollah, which was a far, far more powerful fighting force than Hamas. So these kinds of things, they're kinetic, they're dynamic, they They change as you go along, and you find you respond to where you get to. So we'll see what happens in Lebanon. In the past, the Israelis have been here a number of times before. They've occupied southern Lebanon for years on end. They've had a lot of experience, none of it very happy. So we'll see whether they want to repeat that. And now we are also in the middle of a series of exchanges with Iran.
Right.
And it's an open book as to how far that goes and whether the escalation gets out of control and we end up in a true regional war.
Safe to say, or is it safe to say, Mark, that the region wants an end to this? I mean, what does the region want, and how does that factor in?
Well, I think, in the Arab states, the Gulf states, the leaders in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc., they desperately want an end to this. It's extremely dangerous for them. Their populations are, very motivated by the plight of the Palestinians. It puts them in a very, very difficult position. Jordan is a staunch U.S. ally. Saudi has very close ties to the U.S. as well. All of them were, restoring or rebuilding relations with Israel before October 7 last year. So they have been put in a very difficult position. Iran is a different kettle of fish altogether. Part of the reason why October 7 happened was in order to prevent that kind of reconciliation, the creation of a stronger security, U.S.-led security coalition between the Arab states and Israel, which Iran saw as a threat. So Hamas has, moved to unpick all of that. In that, they've been very successful so far. It's impossible for the moment for the Saudis to go ahead with the kind of reconciliation with Israel that they were, hoping to before October the 7th.
Right.
Mark, we only have about a minute.
I think it's, very different depending on which side of, which country you're talking about.
We only have about a minute left, but very briefly, to what extent does the future of Netanyahu and what he does depend on who wins the presidential election here in the U.S.?
That's a good question. I don't think we should assume that, I think it's fair to assume that Netanyahu would prefer to see Donald Trump elected. He was more comfortable with Trump in office, and he may feel that he would be more comfortable after November as well. But I don't think that, the U.S. determines everything here. The U.S. has actually been very, been able to determine very little so far. And I don't think that will change after the election. So this is, the dynamic is set very much in Israel, by Israel, and by the Iranians, by Hezbollah, and by Hamas. The U.S. is, limited tools.
Well, certainly a lot to think about. Here we are in this 1 year, Mark, since really everything, the war started, if I can use that word. Bloomberg Opinion International Affairs columnist Mark Champion. Check out Mark's story and more from Bloomberg Opinion on the Bloomberg and at Bloomberg.com/opinion. Coming up, we switch gears a little bit, that time of year, meaning it's never too early to talk about some kind of shopping.
Do you have your costume yet for Halloween?
Not yet.
Not yet?
But I used to spend big time.
There's still time.
There's still time. That's coming up next. We talk holiday retail shopping. This is Bloomberg.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We begin with a number of developing stories. First of all, the latest on Hurricane Milton, just getting word that Orlando International Airport will cease commercial operations on Wednesday morning in advance of Hurricane Milton. That according to a post on X. Milton's winds, according to the National Hurricane Center, now up to 175 miles an hour. And Alphabet must lift restrictions that prevent developers from setting up rival marketplaces that compete with its Google Play Store. This according to a federal judge in San Francisco, upending the search giant's dominance in the lucrative Android app market. Alphabet shares, they're down now by 1.9%. Stocks are trading near session lows. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ very much in the red, with the S&P now down by 42 points, a decline of 0.7%. The Dow down almost 400 points now, down 393, a decline of 0.9%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index holding just above 18,000. It is down 134 points for NASDAQ, a drop now of 0.7%. 10-year at 4.01%, but the 2-year that's yielding 3.98%. Gold down $10 the ounce, 26.42, a drop of 0.4%. Big move for crude today, 77.21 on WTI, up by 3.8%, and a barrel of Brent up 3.8%, 81.01 on Brent. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Well, one programming note, JP Morgan CEO and Chairman Jamie Dimon sitting down for an exclusive interview with our own Lisa Abramowitz. This is at the JP Morgan Techstars Conference that's happening in London. The two will be talking about global markets, so much to talk about. Also, tech investments, risks, and opportunities within the world of AI, the global economy, and also U.S. elections. So it'll be a very timely conversation. JP Morgan reports at the end of the week.
It's that time, Carol.
For earnings.
For earnings. It's also that time for
'tis the season.
Spooky decorations. I don't know if you saw this over the weekend where you live, Carol, but kind of everybody was out putting up the cobwebs.
Yes.
Accidentally dropping things off the roof if they were trying to like spread things out. That happened to my neighbors.
I'm always opening up like windows and I'm like tucking in the cobweb
Yeah.
and like quick slamming the window to like hold it. Yeah, it's a little crazy.
Okay.
It gets messy.
Spiders, webs, witches, pumpkins.
Mm-hmm.
And what about those skeletons?
Ginormous,
Yeah.
I believe you have to say, Halloween skeletons. They're on front lawns. In the case of all of us who are in urban neighborhoods, I mean, they are on so many, in front of so many homes in my neighborhood. They're on the front stoops or like right next to them. Wall Street Journal's out with a great story, in fact, on how these are jangling the nerves of neighbors, causing homeowners associations to not leave them up past Halloween, basically. Apparently, some leave them up, put a red cap on, carry them through Christmas.
Why not?
Top hat for,
Like I
don't
said
know,
before,
New Year's.
where are you going to store them? The giant skeletons, where are you going to keep them?
I know, they're giant. They're massive. All right, in all, some $11.6 billion will be spent on Halloween. According to the National Retail Federation, we wanted to take a dive into what's going on in retail.
Yeah, back with us for thoughts on the Halloween shopping season, also the upcoming retail season. Back with us is Katie Thomas. She's lead at the Kearney Consumer Institute. It's an internal think tank of global management consulting firm Kearney. They analyze consumer behavior. They do decision making to help businesses address consumer needs. She joins us once again from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Before we talk about what's happening in the next few months, let's talk about the impact of these storms. Milton, in Florida, people are preparing for this to hit in the coming days. I'm wondering, and especially people still over the last week and now cleaning up from Helene just in recent days, what effect is that going to have on the consumer outlook this season?
Yeah, I mean, I think you definitely see consumers responding. What tends to happen sometimes, Tim, with these big news stories is you see these little dips in spend as people are sort of drawn to their TV and they're just not thinking about, going out, doing some of that shopping. It tends to be more around the bigger purchases where the uncertainty is not driving spend. But one thing that's hard to say is really how much you'll see it across the country versus just small regional impacts. Because in general, we've found that Halloween decorating has provided actually some certainty in uncertain times. And a lot of consumers have embraced exactly what you're describing, the decor, the candy, some of the tradition around the holiday. But, you certainly see some of these natural disasters really weighing on consumers, especially those impacted.
In general, like prior to the storm, how were consumers feeling?
You know, right now in the U.S., you're seeing that continued sort of mismatch between how consumers say they're feeling and what the numbers actually say. So consumers still continue to voice to us that they're fairly stressed, but that stress has also stayed stable. We haven't seen it go up in stress. We've seen a little bit of an uptick in concerns around the cost of living, but for the most part, they're embracing where we are. And I think in particular, once we get through the election, we expect even more stability for the U.S. consumer, because that uncertainty that can restrict a little bit of spending will then go away.
Regardless of who wins the election?
Yeah, honestly, regardless, because it's just living in that waiting game. I mean, that's what we saw all through COVID, right? We were really dealing with the anxiety of consumers of like not knowing what's going to happen next. So I actually anticipate a solid holiday season, because people do like to spend at the holidays, and we'll be through some of that frustration and uncertainty that is distracting all of us right now. And that's another thing. Halloween is a welcome distraction from living as someone who lives in a swing state. I can't tell you how many texts I get in any given day. So I'll take all the skeletons I can get.
Yeah, it's interesting. Hey, do things like Amazon Prime Day kicking off tomorrow, 2 days, like we were kind of
Amazon
joking.
Prime Days, Carol.
Prime Days.
Prime Days.
We were laughing in the newsroom a little bit, like, wait, do they do this twice a year now? Like, I'm a little
I think
confused.
the one over the summer is multiple days as well.
Right?
So, yeah, I don't know if it's Prime Day anymore.
Does this really move the needle?
Well, this is really, what we're seeing is a kickoff to the holiday season. So this is another carryover, both with Halloween and with the winter holiday season that we've seen from the pandemic, which is longer seasons. So Halloween used to be a little bit more concentrated in the month of October. Now you're seeing Halloween decor go out in stores in August. People are decorating in September, really leaning into it. It's similarly like this is a bit of a kickoff to the holiday season. Now, some people, if they're organized, start to pick up stuff now during these deal days, but we still hear from a lot of consumers that they're really not ready until it's a lot closer to the actual holidays.
Can I just tell you this Wall Street Journal story, which gets into these giant skeletons.
You're back on the giant skeletons?
I am. I'm obsessed. Ever since Lisa Mateo mentioned it on Surveillance this morning, I can't let go. Home Depot's 12-foot skelly has sold out every year since it clanked onto the Halloween decor scene in 2020. Retailer sells the $299 Skelly earlier and earlier, with limited online sales this year starting in April. It limits how many shoppers can buy, allowing only one at a time to deter reselling. Again, this is in the Wall Street Journal. I mean, they just like all of a sudden were nowhere, and now they're everywhere. And I know in my neighborhood, like I said, we all have like 12 feet maybe in front, a little bit, like not much frontage, and they're there.
I kind of thought this was like a pandemic thing.
Yeah.
And then it turns out that...
Did they come out in the pandemic?
Yeah, 2020.
Yeah. Oh, that's
they
right,
came out,
2020.
fall of 2020. And then, and that was sort of the consumer spending, right? Nobody was doing anything.
Right.
So they were buying stuff. They were buying couches. They were buying stuff for their homes. They were buying, 12-foot skeletons. But it's continued.
Yeah, which is kind of interesting. Well, and to that, I mean, I guess, what do you watch most? We know how important consumer spending is, certainly to the U.S. economy. We've been focused on the job market, right? We just got a strong report. So when it comes to factors and things, you guys are a think tank, right? You analyze, you have clients, you have to advise on what consumers are doing. Is it the jobs market that you watch most closely? If there's one factor that you watch, what is it?
Yeah, so I think you're right, Carol, but what I would say, so we're actually getting ready to launch the latest version of our consumer sentiment index. It's called the Consumer Stress Index. And what we watch is actually the consumer version of the job market, which is personal job security. So sometimes, as we know, with jobs, it's not always a perfect tie out to the jobs that are available and the people that are looking, and just in general, how safe people feel in their jobs. So we've seen a slight uptick in the last 6 months of people's personal job insecurity. So being a little bit more nervous. If I were to lose a job, it would be harder to find a new job, but it's also small. So I think that no red flags here yet, but something that's on the mind of consumers is that labor market, it's a little bit hard to read, I think, on an individual basis.
All right, we're going to leave it on that note. Listen, hey, thank you so much. So appreciate it. Katie Thomas, lead at the Carney Consumer Institute, joining us from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Hey, taking a look at the markets, just over an hour until the close of U.S. U.S. trading here in New York, taking a little bit of a turn lower. The S&P 500 down more than 1%. Tech taking a hit today. The NASDAQ down more than 1.2%. The Dow also down right now by 1.2%.
Yeah, we're pretty much at our lows of the day, and you're seeing pretty broad-based selling. 445 names in the S&P 500 showing declines. Hey, folks, when we come back, the 100% yields that are fueling a retail boom in new quick buck ETFs. It's the Bloomberg Big Take.
Listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
All right, Tim, so check it out. They're all the rage.
We're on TikTok?
Yeah. Could be.
They are.
Yeah, totally. Derivatives enhanced exchange traded funds. It's a mouthful. They've become a big hit with retail investors who are piling into a slew of bold-faced trades, including those that amp up the daily returns of the hottest stocks on the planet. Sign me up, right?
Yeah, you know, what goes up might also go down. That's
point.
What they say. With more on today's Bloomberg Big Take, it means our editors believe it's a story that you may not, but should have on your radar. Turns out it's one of the most read stories on the Bloomberg as well. So let's get to it. With us is Bloomberg News cross-asset reporter Denitsa Sakova. She's here in the Bloomberg studio. I want to start out by the TikTok element of this, because how often do you go to a social media platform that's like outside of the realm of like finance, Twitter, how it used to be, and you have derivatives enhanced ETFs that are like being talked about?
This is exactly where we started the stories. We looked at YouTube, we looked at TikTok, we looked at Reddit, where maybe you can imagine that space, and we figured out that there are tens of thousands of people discussing yields. And some of those yields are crazy. We're talking about 160%, some of those products. So obviously it's kind of hard to crunch the complexity of a derivative enhanced covered call product in 30 seconds video.
Did they dance while they did it?
It's not so much dancing. It's an interesting interesting idea of people doing it. Like it's more like a professional, looking at the screen, showing all those charts. So it's giving more of that. But we looked at that and just incredible growth. There is the genre of a short TikToks, but there is also the genre of YouTube videos of like a 1 hour conversation with a portfolio manager. So you have a really wide spectrum of content. You have Instagram posts. It's really all over social media, and it's growing very fast. And it's a really big community. And the numbers that reflect on actual Wall Street numbers, on all those financial institutions, are incredible.
Well, walk us through them, and what are derivatives enhanced ETFs? And then talk to us, give us some context about how many funds are out there and how many assets are in them and the kind of volume and activity we're seeing.
For sure. So more broadly, we've talked about all products that use any type of options derivative. So it could be covered call, it could be leverage products, it could be buffer products, all those super sophisticated terms that were very often used only by institutional investors. Now, all of them are easy accessible on your phone, whatever retail trading platform you use. You have a lot of access to them. They were just 50 billion 5 years ago. Now we're 300 billion. So it's growing very fast. We really had to keep updating the data every day because it's just constantly, the launches are just incredible numbers. We saw as many as 25 in one filing. And this year we're seeing a record 160 filings. So it's coming so fast.
Called fund houses, follow the money, right? Where investors want to put it.
Exactly. And there is a money aspect of it. The issuers are charging pretty high fees.
Are they?
Yes, much higher than the average ETF. So there is the money aspect for sure.
That's Kostanica, right? Their performance is incredible.
Yeah.
All right. Is it?
Well, the performance aspect is separate, right?
I was being sarcastic.
Of course, I know you are. But on total return basis, a lot of those products trail what the underlying is. So obviously it comes as like, oh, I'll give you 100% yield, but it comes with a price. And the price is often underperformance, especially in those covered call ETFs. The way they generate income is they sell options, but then they limit the actual exposure you have to an index or to a stock. And if there is a big rally, which we have seen for 2 years,
right,
you end up underperforming a lot and sometimes being charged a pretty high fee for it.
What happens to these products in a market that is not going up?
Actually, in the downside market, some of those products are doing well. Going back to the covered call strategies, and there is a very wide range. So we have JP Morgan having a covered call strategy on an index on the S&P 500. That's a really big product, close to 40 billion. That product did very well in 2022, which is where some of that buzz started because everything was down, bonds, stocks, everyone was panicking. So suddenly there was this covered call strategy that was actually doing relatively well in terms of outperforming the S&P. It was still down on the year, but people really put their money there and it did better, right? It outperformed against the S&P. And at the same time, it gave you those monthly, weekly, quarterly, whatever payments. So that was a very new thing for retail traders.
So is it a product just for down markets versus up markets?
Well, initially the idea of covered call and how it was used by institutions, yes, it should be a very defensive trade. But when you put a covered call on Tesla and you try to generate a yield above 100%, it switches into something entirely different. And I think that's where the question is like, is it defensive? Is it about timing the market?
Well, what do regulators say? Are they?
We actually spoke to a lot of the regulators. It's an interesting space where a lot of it's down to marketing. In the first place, regulation allowed this just a few years ago. There were a lot of changes to streamline the process. And we spoke to the SEC advocates, and they said they're pretty concerned because there is a limited menu of things that are available. And at the same time, we see retail traders are becoming more and more active. They're not very shy in the use of their products. So potentially they may need some help of risk management.
Just very briefly, it's also a story about how ETFs continue to just take over the world.
For sure. It's just like we just hit constant records. Active management in ETFs, bond ETFs. It's just every corner of the ETF industry is growing.
Yeah.
And retail traders are part of it.
Yeah, totally get it. Fascinating story. And as we said, it's the Bloomberg Big Take. It's also among our most read stories on the Bloomberg today. Danica, thank you so much. Danica Sukova, she's cross-asset reporter here at Bloomberg News. As we said, you can find her story on the Bloomberg terminal and also at Bloomberg.com. If you're watching on TV, the close is coming your way in just a moment. Tim and I continuing on Business Week. We talk
energy, hurricane, and then we got a new book, too. We're talking with the author. That's next on Business Week.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, we are just 1 hour away from the closing bell on this Monday, October 7th, 2024. Carol Masser along with Tim Stenivek, and we have seen stocks take a leg down, and I'm not sure if it's concerns over the Middle East. We've got a lot going on this week. We're going to kick off earnings season. We've got an inflation print, but definitely, and we've got yields back up. So maybe some concerns about what the Fed may
A big part of the move lower is a sell-off in some of the world's largest tech companies. We heard the headline from Charlie a little earlier, Alphabet sinking after a judge ruled that it must lift restrictions that prevent developers from setting up rival marketplaces that compete with its Google Play Store. Carol, this is why I wait so long to do my decliners.
I know, right?
You never know
the
when
market,
a judge is going to make a ruling.
Now I got to go look at my gainers and see if I've lost some ground. All right, folks, let's get to it. Still ahead in the next 2 hours here on Bloomberg Business Week. Energy front and center. There are so many. When we were planning this morning, there were just so many different headlines coming out of, the commodity markets, oil, concerns over the Middle East, but also specific ones to some of the big oil giants. So we're going to get into that. Ellen Wald, she wrote the book on Aramco. She's going to join us to talk about the energy sector in just a moment.
Also not entirely unrelated to energy. All eyes on Milton as it strengthens to a Category 5.
Again, right? We're barely over Helene, and we've got another one bearing down on us. We're going to also sit down with the author of a new book, Tim teased that, who says companies need to get back to focusing on their most overlooked stakeholders. And we are talking about all of us worker bees.
You've heard customers are always right?
Yeah, what about employees?
Well, that's exactly what the book's about.
Yeah, I cannot wait to dig into it with him. And then we've got a cool guest as well.
Yeah, I just actually wrapped up watching Shogun on Hulu.
Did you?
So, yeah. I just finished it. That was awesome. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Very cool.
Right.
We're going to be speaking with the director of some hit shows, including Shogun, Rings of Power, and so many more. That's during our 4 o'clock hour. First up, though, a check on the day's trade and top business stories. Here's Charlie Pellet.
Right, thank you very much, Tim and Carol. 58 minutes to go until the closing bell clangs on Wall Street with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ deeply in the red. Worst level of the day right now, right to the numbers. A lot of cross currents, but the Dow down almost 500 points, down 1.2% right now on the Dow. S&P down 60, a drop right now of 1%. NASDAQ down 217, down 1.2%. Russell 2000 index of small cap shares is slumping 1.4%. To be sure, we are at the worst level of the day for the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ. 10-year, 4.02% right now, with a 2-year, 4.00%. Gold is down $13 the ounce, down 0.5%. And West Texas Intermediate crude rallying right now. WTI surging by 4%, 77.35 for a barrel of WTI. As for the overall market backdrop, Seema Shah is Chief Global Strategist at Principal Asset Management.
This is a sweet spot. This is a great environment for equities. You've got a strong economy. It's slowing, I still think, but it's strong. And you've got a Fed who is still willing to cut rates. We still think there's a 25 basis point cut in November and December. Probably slower move through 2025, but it's still a rate cutting cycle backed up by a strong economy. I think it's a great environment.
Seema Shah of Principal Asset Management. A rare analyst downgrade for Amazon. Its shares are lower now, down 3.3%. Wells Fargo Securities cutting the stock to equal weight from overweight, citing concerns over margin trends into next year. And the day's other top tech story, Alphabet must, according to a federal judge, lift restrictions that prevent developers from setting up rival marketplaces that compete with its Google Play Store. Alphabet shares down now by 2.3%. Recapping, S&P down 1% for on-demand news 24 hours a day. Subscribe to Bloomberg News now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Hey, thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Do appreciate it. Brent crude soared to $80 a barrel, its highest price going back to August. Mounting tensions in the Middle East, raising speculation, Carol, that Israel may attack Iran's oil infrastructure.
There's so many headlines, I've got to be honest with you, when it comes to energy. Tim and I were just
there's an entire page of headlines that you put in these notes.
No, it's just kind of crazy. From Chevron selling some Canadian oil sand and shale assets for about $6.5 billion. You also had BP abandoning a target to cut oil and gas output by 2030. That's from Reuters.
Saudi Arabia is preparing to make a multi-billion-dollar bet on hydrogen that will launch a new company. and then Equinor in the wind space buying a $2.5 billion stake in Ørsted, the Danish wind giant.
It all just kind of comes together, which is why we knew we wanted to talk to Dr. Ellen Wald. She's president at Transversal Consulting, which focuses on the intersection of energy and geopolitics. Yeah, nothing going on there. Little sarcasm. She's also senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, author of Saudi Inc., which is all about Aramco and the company's role and huge historical significance in the region. She joins us from Jacksonville, Florida.
Hey, before we get to the latest on energy, certainly related to hurricanes and storms, we have to ask, everything okay ahead of Milton? You're in Jacksonville, which you know you won't see the worst of it.
I'm actually in South Florida in Boca Raton now.
Okay.
Everything is probably going to be fine here, but there's definitely major concern for the West Coast and also through Orlando and through there. So there's definitely some major concern with this hurricane for most of the state, just not exactly where I am.
How do you think about, before we get into some of the headlines and obviously the Middle East, but climate change and the impact that could potentially have either on just disrupting the systems, causing systems to go down? I mean, I don't know. How does it factor in to how you think about the energy markets?
So that's an interesting thought. I think the most important things when you think about hurricanes and systems and energy, I think the most important things we've got going on now is that there's a lot more capital concentrated in areas that are hurricane prone now than there used to be.
Yeah,
So when we talk about level of destruction, there's a lot more destruction going on because there's just a lot more in Florida and in areas that are hurricane prone. And so it can be hard to kind of measure and say, well, is this really way more destructive? A lot of we're looking at a lot of things in terms of comparing this hurricane to one that happened in 1921. And so I think it's really hard to say like, oh yes, climate change has caused this. When you think about energy, it's definitely of concern. Florida gets all of its oil supplies, or almost all of them, via barges that go to Tampa. It doesn't have a lot of ports. It doesn't have a lot of pipelines. And so for the entire state, energy and access to gasoline can be concerning during a hurricane simply because, if a highway is flooded out, then tankers can't necessarily get to certain locations. So it's obviously something, that we need to keep an eye on, even if you aren't in the direct path of a hurricane.
What about when it comes to disruptions at rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, which we have seen during previous hurricane events, during previous tropical storms? Why is the focus on rising oil prices now out of the Middle East and not because of disruption in the U.S.?
So that's interesting. I think it can very much depend on exactly where the hurricane is going. And this hurricane is taking